Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land into your town, into your home, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings to all of you from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophony of conversation. Glad to be back with you once again. You know, as listeners and members of the Coast family know, the kind of material we cover on this program night after night, we plunge headfirst into UFOs, ghosts, the paranormal, conspiracies, things that go bump in the night. Every now and then, though, we run face first into a mystery that is new, or at least one that has a new twist. After we hear about it, we never quite look at the world in the same way. And tonight, we've got one of those kind of programs. This is spooky stuff. And I think those of you who are listening tonight are going to remember this interview for a long time. It'll pop back into your heads the next time you go camping, or if you take the family to a national park, or even if you go for a hike through the woods near your house. It's not only one mystery, it's hundreds of mysteries, because that's how many people have vanished, as if into thin air. The true number could be much higher. Probably no one knows what it is. We really don't know. That's the flip side of this coin. Another mystery: why the government agencies in charge of our national parks and forests have kept a lid on this. They not only haven't told us, but have gone to great lengths to not even keep tabs on this confidentially, as if they don't want to know themselves. And they sure as hell don't want us to know either. Where have we heard that before? My guest is David Paulides, a longtime lawman turned business executive turned Bigfoot hunter and author. David is one of my favorite guests. I've interviewed him on Coast a couple of times about his remarkably well-documented books about Sasquatch encounters among Native Americans. That work sort of led him to the subject at hand. He started looking into disappearances in wilderness areas, national parks and forests, and ran into a stone wall. But he's compiled this gigantic collection of missing person files, so many that he couldn't fit them all into one book, so he's written two. The title of both is Missing 411, but he has subtitles. One of the books focuses on the western U.S. and Canada, the other on the eastern part of our country. No matter where you live and where you're listening to this program from, there's a case, maybe several cases, not that far from your home. And the millions of people who visit national parks every year need to know about this, need to be aware so they can pay attention, take precautions. But the government sure as hell isn't going to tell you about it. Dave Paulides is. And yes, when I first heard the premise, I thought, well, there could be all sorts of reasons why people vanish out in the woods. I mean, it's easy to get lost out there. That's wilderness. People can get hurt. They get attacked by animals. Sometimes they could be kidnapped by criminals operating out there or crazy people. But as you will hear, the weird circumstances that pop up in these case files over and over make it clear that something else is afoot here. People are being snatched, taken, lured, some of them almost entranced. We'll approach the topic in sort of the same way that Dave lays out his books, case by case, because I think that's the best way to point out that explaining all of this is not going to be easy. There's no one-sentence explanation that'll make them all go away. It's just weird. And some of these tales will chill you right down to the marrow of your bones. We'll need more than the usual time to cover all this ground, so Dave will be joining me in just a few minutes from now. A couple of quick news notes, though. A monster earthquake in the ocean off the coast of central Chile today, 7.2 on the Richter scale. The government there ordered the evacuation of some coastal areas, fearing a tsunami. No word yet on deaths or injuries. In San Francisco, police have arrested a man in connection with the gruesome murders of 5 people. The bodies of 3 women and 2 men were found in a home on Friday. Officers today arrested a 35-year-old man who apparently knew the victims. He's been booked on 5 counts of murder. Former Vice President Dick Cheney recovering in Virginia after undergoing a heart transplant a couple of days ago. His doctors today defended the operation, said Cheney did not get any special treatment in obtaining his donor heart. Cheney suffered 5 heart attacks over the past few years, so he certainly needed a new ticker. Heck of an interesting story unfolding out in the Pacific Ocean. Filmmaker James Cameron is waiting to take a little dive to the bottom, way down to the bottom, the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth. 7 miles down, they figure they'll dive, which would be the deepest anyone has ever gone. Bad weather postponed the dive, according to the AP. We have a story about it on the Coast website. Also there, a new edition of Naps News compiled by webmaster Tim Binnall and me. One story on our list about President Obama's visit to Roswell a couple of days ago. While he's there, of course, he made some wisecracks about he still wants to keep all the secrets, an offhand reference, of course, to the Roswell incident. Yuckity yuck yuck. Real funny stuff. I'd say it's even less funny when you look at the record of the Obama administration on issues of openness in government. Despite all the promises that he made as a candidate, by some standard, he's even less open, has thrown up more roadblocks to freedom of information than his predecessor, who was pretty bad about secrecy in government. Also, there is a link to the National Security Archives. If you want to know how our government keeps tabs on what everyone else has underground, facilities-wise, base-wise, there's a pretty cool report on this link here. And if you follow national security and secrecy issues, that website is one great resource. If you think UFO sightings started with Kenneth Arnold in 1947, check another link we have in Naps News. It's about early American UFO sightings as far back as 1639. A couple of other newsworthy bits and pieces there, including sightings of a dog-headed pig monster in Africa. Take a look at all that when you get some time. Time now to jump feet first into the deep end of the pool. What has happened to hundreds of people who vanished into thin air? We'll hear the story from David Paulides right after this on Coast to Coast AM. As I mentioned, Dave Paulides has been my guest a couple of times on this program, and I find him to be one of the very most credible, most knowledgeable interviewees when the subject comes to Bigfoot, Sasquatch. He holds 2 degrees from the University of San Francisco, spent 20 years in law enforcement and senior executive positions in the technology sector, had a boyhood camping experience with his father in the late 60s that got him hooked on the subject of Bigfoot, and then a couple of years ago, he was one of the founders of the North America Bigfoot Search, written a couple of really excellent books on it, and I suspect that it was his interest in that topic that got him started on this one. But the new book is, as I mentioned, Missing 411, 2 volumes. Dave, great to have you back on the program.
Hey, George, thanks for having me.
Spooky stuff. Spooky.
It's very, very strange.
Let's start this way. You started asking questions at at national parks, asking questions. I can guess what they were about, and you sort of caused a little hubbub within the National Park Service. They're not being very cooperative, but one night you get a knock on the door. You don't want to say where because you don't want to give the source away, but tell me that story and how you started down this path.
So I was in the park and just asking some questions, talking to people. I usually don't go to the Park Service themselves because they're pretty closed-mouthed about things, but some of the employees on the periphery that are employed by the concessionaires and things, they talk. And it got around that I was there, and there aren't many places to stay in the location I was at. And in the middle of, just before we went to bed, there was a knock at the door, and the guy says, Dave, you probably don't know me, but I heard you were in the park. I know of your work. I know of your background, and I think there's a story here that you would be apt to investigate, and I think there's something there. And he came in, and we ended up talking for quite a while. And he had worked at a couple of different parks, and he had experienced the same phenomena at each park, and that is that there were disappearances in the park that didn't make a lot of sense on the front, and there wasn't much investigation going on the back end after the people disappeared, and there was even fewer press releases and press follow-up and media coverage about the issues. And he said that he thought that it was unusual and it wasn't normal, and if it had happened in a city or in a county where there was sheriff's officer, PD jurisdiction, that it would be getting far more press and far more follow-up, and he just thought it was very odd that this kept recurring where he was at. And he says, I don't want to raise a red flag, but I know you do thorough investigations, and, maybe you'd look into this. I said, it sounds interesting, and for sure. And he left, and I only had one conversation with this person, never had another conversation with him again, didn't do any follow-up with him. And on the way home, I had a few conversations with some people that I work with, and I threw the idea by him. I said, get on the computer, see what you can find. And right away they did some archive search, and they said, there's something here. And that started a 3+ year, 7,000-hour investigation that ended up covering North America, U.S. and Canada, and we ended up phenomenally, finding 28 clusters of missing people in rural areas of North America. And that includes not only national parks, national forests. This could be just open space of the Department of the Interior. And even one of our clusters is the entire state of Pennsylvania. And I know that may not make sense when I'm saying it right now, but in a speck of time in the late 40s and 50s, there were so many missing kids in that state that disappeared under phenomenally similar circumstances that I know that nobody would have been able to put it together unless you sat down and did something stupid like we did and just gnawed away at the data. And the way they disappeared, the times they disappeared, the locations, it just all falls in a very strange phenomena.
You know, when you were first telling me what you were working on some time ago, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, but it would take a lot of convincing because, of course, it is wilderness. It's wild. It's the woods. People get lost in the woods. People get lost out in the middle of nowhere. They fall down. They hurt themselves. They get disoriented. Bad weather, animal attacks, whatever. Just seemed to me like, you know, I could think of a lot of reasons why people would disappear out there, but you're talking about something at a whole different level. Why don't we approach that in a general, talk about the general premise, and then we'll get into some specifics.
So let's separate disappearances between voluntary and involuntary. A lot of people want to disappear. They may be suicidal. They just want to fall out of the world. They want to take off. There's no crime in that. They can do it. And let's say that's adults. But when you talk about kids, and I say kids, say anything under than 10, 11, 12, I mean, I have two. I can't see my kids wanting to even step more than 100 feet away from our campsite, especially when it's starting to get dark, because there's always this stigma about darkness and force. And so those are involuntary disappearances. And when you look at those and you start to look at hundreds of cases, you start to see similarities that start staring at you. And your initial assessment that, yeah, people disappear in the woods, yeah, it's a natural phenomenon. It happens. Exactly, it does happen. But if there's an animal attack, let's say a bear attack or a mountain lion attack, there's going to be fallout from that searchers and law enforcement personnel are going to find. They're going to find a lot of tracks. There's going to be a lot of blood. Yeah. There might be a lot of clothing. But in these disappearances, you're not finding that. And when they bring tracking dogs in, canines, bloodhounds, they do strange things. And a lot of times, they can't even find a scent. But at other times, when you read the search and rescue logs or you read the articles in the papers from years and years ago, every once in a while, there's something very critical in there that a lot of writers and a lot of search and rescue people won't put in, but that is the dog sits down and won't search. It'll walk up to say a fork in a trail, and it'll just stop. And the handler will put a note in there, unusual, dog won't move, or dog doesn't feel like searching, or whatever it might be. The other part that's unusually strange, and search and rescue people have faced this hundreds of times, and that is that the canine or the bloodhound will track to a river. And we're talking a big river, a tough one for you and I to cross, but any kid under 10 would never cross it. And they track it to a river. Well, the assessment is the kid went in the river, kid drowned. And that's essentially the end of the search. If they're really thorough, and this has happened a couple times, they'll dam the river, get permission from Fish and Game, shut it down, and search. And every one of the times they've done that, they never find the missing child. Now, a few of the times, under very unusual circumstances, a search and rescue professional says, we'll search the other side just for the heck of it. And son of a gun, if not on the other side, miles away, they find the kid. Now, how did the kid cross the river? Now, search and rescue people won't answer it, and it's left in the dark, and it's never answered in a report. But the question is, how did the kid get across?
It's not only rivers. I should say I think that was the eeriest part of the book, is reading about the distance that some of these kids travel, dead of winter, no shoes on. They are found, and they're going counterintuitively up mountains. Talk about that in generalities, and then we'll get into it in specifics.
So in the search and rescue world, there's parameters that are set down based on topography, whether it's hilly ground, flat ground, river, water, cold, wet, dry, hot, and they base it on the age, the health, and on these topographical conditions about how far to set out the grid pattern. And many, and we'll talk about kids here, many of these times in these cases, these kids are found way outside the parameters. And I'm not talking 25% outside. I'm talking several 100% outside. And just like you said, one of the common themes that you'll read about in these stories is that the kids are found without shoes. Now, what I keep looking to find in the reports is when the child's found, I want to know what the condition of their feet are. But it's never mentioned. Because my question is that if their feet walked 14 miles over 3 mountain ranges in 14 hours at the age of 8 years old, wow, those feet must be destroyed. But they never mention it. And if you read the guidelines on the search and rescue versus what's found here, they make completely no sense. And I think a lot of times the search and rescue people are perplexed, but they do an extremely competent job with the parameters that they have. And when they reach these cases that are completely outside the norm, I think many times the kids may never be found because there's no rational reason to search out that far.
One of the other things, I will talk about this generally too, and then get specifics as we go along, is the clothing. You mentioned about having kids having no shoes on, that you would find pieces of clothing here or there, but there's some really weird stuff goes on with clothing that further perplexes the whole thing. In that, a bear attacks somebody and eats them, there are going to be bits and pieces of clothing show up in the scat. It doesn't happen in these cases. In fact, some of the clothes look like they're taken off and just folded there, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's several cases where people are eaten up, and there's just bits and pieces of them, and they find a pair of pants nearby where one of the pant legs or both pant legs are turned inside out, as though something has taken the pants off of the people before they ate them. And then scat nearby of a bear is analyzed, and there's no human remains in the scat, and there's no clothing remains. And later we can talk about a case out of the Yukon Territory with a really famous guy named Bart Schleier, exactly what happened. Another case out of northern Canada with a young girl, same thing happened. Now, if I talked about this by itself, say Schleier's case or the girl in northern Canada, no one would think much about it, and it was an anomaly. But I know that nobody has ever put multiple cases together like this and said, wow, what's happening? This can't be coincidence. There's got to be a reason. Somebody wrote to me a while ago, and they said, Dave, we just read your book, and oh my God, this applies. And it's a theme out of James Bond. And he said, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. And that's kind of what I think sometimes with this, because it happens too many times to be coincidence.
Well, as I said, we're going to get into specifics. I intentionally want to focus, after this break, I want to focus on the National Park Service, federal agencies, I guess including the FBI, because am I correct in putting it this way, that you ran into a stone wall right from the get-go?
That'd be a fair assessment.
And so were you able to, I can't tell if you were able to, I know a lot of these files, you rely on media reports, so you know that these incidents happened, but did you ultimately fail in getting all the information that you wanted to get using freedom of information?
So one thing I say in the book is that the people that work in the park that you and I see when we drive in, those people are phenomenal. They service us. They work for the good of the Park Service. They know nothing about what we're talking about. I'm talking about probably the top 15 people in the Park Service know what we're talking about right now and know what they're doing, and they're doing it methodically and logically. And that is that when we first started off, we knew that the Park Service had one of the largest federal contingent law enforcement groups of any that patrol open spaces. With a law enforcement group that size, and the number of, there's over 350 different monuments, parks, et cetera, that they patrol, they've got to have a pretty good database of knowledge. And we have the Freedom of Information Act that's given to us by the government, where we can retrieve information and data from our federal agencies.
Dave, I'm going to ask you to stop right there, because I want to pick that story up when we come back, just how much difficulty you ran into right off the bat in dealing with the National Park Service in particular. Stay with us. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with David Paulides about his new 2-volume book, Missing 411. When we come back, we resume the conversation about the stone wall he ran into. And it's not just a refusal to give information. It's a real haughty attitude on the part of the National Park Service. That and more coming up on Coast to Coast AM. All right, David, you were saying before we took the break that the National Park Service has this gigantic law enforcement apparatus, and one would think if there are hundreds of people disappearing for whatever reason within the national parks that they would keep some kind of a list and would want the public to know about it. What did you find?
Well, let's back up for a second. Let's just talk about a municipal law enforcement agency or a sheriff's department in the U.S. of moderate size. Almost all of them have a website, and almost all of them have a missing person aspect to that site, meaning that they list the people missing in that jurisdiction, date, time, location, etc. And it allows the public to keep an eye out for these people, let you know what's going on in the community, etc. Well, the National Park Service has a big website, and it has a lot of things on it. There's no missing person website portion to that website. There's no links. There's no mention of it anywhere. But, with the knowledge that if I was running a national park and I had limited resources, I'd buy a clipboard with some graph paper, and every time somebody disappeared, I'd write their name down, the location they disappeared, age, etc. And that would be the inexpensive way to keep a ledger of who was missing. If I could afford a laptop, I could keep 5,000 locations of people missing, and every month when the monthly reports roll in from the National Park Service's other locations to headquarters, I could easily keep track of that on a laptop. Well, through FOIA, we've filed a request to have a list of missing people inside their system. And this went through the Western Regional Office out of Denver, and a woman named Charis, her Charis Wilson, she is a phenomenal person. She's done us she does everything she can to help us, and she's running into a bureaucratic headstorm. And she sends me back a message after we make the request, and she says, Dave, headquarters says they don't have any lists. Well, all of us in law enforcement think, wait, it must be semantics. It can't be true. So I filed it a second time, rewording it. She comes back again, and she says, Dave, I'm really sorry, but they say they don't have any list of any missing people. And I says, okay, how about individual parks? And she says, headquarters says, as far as they know, no parks keep lists of missing people. And I says, okay, Yosemite's pretty close to my house. That's a pretty big national park. They should have sufficient resources to do this. FOIA Yosemite and ask them. They come back and said, nope, Yosemite has no list of missing people. So in FOIA, there's an exemption to get data if you're a published author. So I'm not a world-famous author. I'm just your measly little author of 2 books. I asked for an author's exemption, and I asked for the data from Yosemite on missing people and to give me that data. They come back, and an attorney through FOIA for the Park Service says that my books aren't in enough libraries to get the publishers and authors exemption from paying the price. And if I wanted a list of missing people from Yosemite, it would cost me $34,000.
Jeez. That's just ridiculous. That's just ridiculous.
I says, well, let's take it to the extreme. Let's really run with this. I FOIA'd headquarters. I said, okay, I want a list from the whole system. They come back and they say 1.4 million.
Obviously, they don't want you to have this list. They don't want to put it together. Let me ask the question this way. This is something they should have. It's not just an oversight that they don't have it. I mean, somebody had to make a conscious decision. We're not going to keep a list of this for whatever reason. Or would you agree with that?
So one of the guys we work with, he was the head of a state's law enforcement branch. He's a really, really smart guy. And we sat down and we talked about this, and he said, Dave, these people are not stupid. They obviously don't want the public to know, and they obviously don't want you to have it. And that's probably the best way it could be put.
So how did you get all the files then?
Well, that's a monumental piece of work right there. So every community just outside of a national park or a national monument keeps pretty good tabs on what happens. And the choice is you either go there and you sit in a library and you work it out, and you get in tight with the librarian and you say, hey, do you have a lot of these libraries have files specifically for certain things. And some of these libraries had those files on missing people. And there's certain archive sites on the web that you can subscribe to. And if you're patient enough, and if you have the time, and you know how to query, you can get certain data out of there that's available. And through all of the above, in 3+ years worth of work, eventually this started to roll in.
So, for example, once you get a name of a missing person, say from a newspaper article, are you able to use that name and then force the file out of the Park Service or some other agency?
Sometimes, yes. It usually works the other way. You query, say, missing Glacier National Park. And sometimes it'll go back 30, 40, 50 years on some of the archived locations. Other times not. And then you get the name and you FOIA the national park for the file. Now, the interesting thing about that is one of the clusters of disappearances is Crater Lake. So we FOIA'd Crater Lake on a series of disappearances there. And again, Cheris from Denver comes back and says, Dave, I'm embarrassed to tell you, we lost all the files in 12 years at that park.
Huh. Oops.
I said, come on. And she goes, no, we really don't have them. I mean, I believe her because I believe what she's saying is the truth. But where are they?
Now that they know that they should have one of these, and they know you're going to stir up a lot of trouble over the fact that they don't have one, any response from them indicating they're putting one together, or any indication that they're budging from this horrendous position?
So starting 3.5, approaching 4 years ago when this all started, they told me back then that they were obtaining a grant to start an intensive computer network amongst all of their parks, and this was something that they were going to implement. But like I told you at the beginning, this isn't rocket science, George. I mean, honest to God, with a clipboard and a piece of graph paper, you could start tracking this today. And then every month, each park or each monument sends in a report to National Park headquarters. Well, somebody's reading these, somebody's taking notes and deriving statistical data, and knowing that missing people is a hot topic, that you would think that those statistics would be very important.
One other question on this. You got a call from some agent for the Park Service who went beyond just saying no to you. I mean, he really gave you some attitude, and you detail that in the book. Tell me about that.
So Yosemite is one of the biggest clusters of missing people anywhere. And if anyone's been to Yosemite, there's a lot of rock walls, there's a lot of canyons and things. But again, these disappearances don't fall into the realm of normality in any shape, way, or form. And I live in a suburb of San Jose, right near a city called Saratoga. And it just so happens a 15-year-old girl from Saratoga went missing in the early 1980s on a trip with her dad. And she was on horseback, and her dad were with 7 other people. And they rode into a remote area called Sunrise Camps, just outside of Tenaya Lake. And they were about 9,000 feet up, and they rode into an area where there are remote cabins that you can stay at. Her name's Stacy, gets off her horse, her dad gets off her horse, she goes in the cabin, she changes, and there's a 71-year-old man that went along with the group, and she tells her dad, hey, I'm going to go with Mr. So-and-so, and we're going to walk out here to this point 100 feet away that everybody could see, and she brought her camera, and she's going to take some pictures. And the man walks out, and it's high elevation, and he tells Stacy, hey, I'm tired. I'm just going to sit down right here. Everybody sees the man sit down. Stacy tells the man, hey, I'm going to walk down this trail, and it's a very easy trail. It's almost all granite outcropping, very few trees, and I'm going to this lake that almost everybody can see, and she has to walk through a few trees to get to the lake. The man says he sees her walk through the trees, and she doesn't come back. And a large search ensues, and in years and years, they never find anything of Stacy. The only thing they found of hers was right inside that tree line. They found the cap to her camera, her lens cap. And that story intrigued me for several reasons. First of all, it's in an area of Yosemite that doesn't have a lot of trees. There's not a lot of places to hide. The elevation's high. There's a lot of lakes in that area. But it's an unusual case. A 15-year-old girl just vanishes. And to not find a body, not find clothing, not find shoes, something about her is really an unusual event. So I filed a FOIA against the Park Service, and this is probably the 25th or 28th time we filed one on an open missing persons case, meaning the person wasn't found. And just so the audience understands, a missing persons case in law enforcement is not considered a criminal event. It's one of those strange things that the police departments and sheriffs and law enforcement in general investigate, even though it's not a crime for a person to go missing. So it's not a crime. And we get almost 99.9% of all the FOIAs we ask for when the person is still missing. And the only one we've never gotten back is Stacy. And we got a refusal. And so I went back to Charis in Denver. I said, Charis, what's going on? She goes, Dave, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. Yosemite's being strange about this. So it gets back to the special agent, and that's the detective for the Park Service that does follow-up. And at about this time, there's a book written about life and death in Yosemite by a retired ranger named Butch Farabee. And Butch spent 30 years at various national parks. And there's so much death and strange events going on in Yosemite, he wrote a masterful book about it. And it wasn't just about deaths, it was about disappearances and things. And Butch wrote about Stacy. So I called him. I said, Butch, this is what I'm doing. It's a little different than yours. My scope's a little wider, but you did a great job on your book, and I want to know what happened with Stacy. He says, Dave, I saw the file. There shouldn't be any reason you don't have it. They looked at a lot of people at the time. There's no suspects. There's no nothing, Dave. I don't think they have anything on this, and I doubt if anybody's looked at it in 25 or 30 years. Well, out of the blue, I get this call from a special agent in Yosemite. And he says, right off the bat, he says, what do you want this file for? Well, when you go asking for something, you know the law behind it before you start looking, and we know the law. And one of the criteria is, in FOIA, the rationale on why you want something from the government can't be a reason why they ask or why they grant or why they deny, and they can't even ask. This guy asked. I said, well, why are you asking me that? He says, hey, I know who you are, and I know your background, and I want to know why you want it. I says, well, I want it because I'm looking at missing people. I'm writing a book about missing people. Her case is highly unusual, and it's in my backyard. He says, well, you're not going to get it. I said, what do you mean I'm not going to get it? It's an open missing persons case. And I said, is there any criminal element to that? Nope. I said, are there any suspects? Nope. And I said, well, why wouldn't you give it to me then? And he says, well, because we never give away these cases. I says, wait a minute. I have dozens and dozens of these cases from your agency all over the U.S. And he goes, no, you don't. I go, yes, I do. And we get into this talk, and he challenges me. He's rude. He says right from the get-go, I'm never going to get this. And so far, he's right. I've appealed this to the National Park Service. I've gone to a congressman. They cannot get that file. Today, out of the blue, I get a call from the cousin of George Aris, who since is deceased, who actually went to the scene when Stacy disappeared and helped with the search efforts. And I explained to him what's going on. And he says he's going to try to intervene on behalf of the family to find out why this case isn't getting opened and released. And he's upset about it. So the point being is that, if you have nothing to conceal, why not show it? The agent said, well, if I give you the case, that'll compromise any future prosecution. I said, prosecution for what? Most of the people involved in this are dead. The 71-year-old man is long gone. Her dad's long gone. Half the people involved that were on that trip are deceased. Do you have a suspect? No. Are you investigating a crime? No. It's baffling.
Tell me this. Within your research, were you able to develop relationships with NPS staff members, former, maybe retired folks who would talk to you off the record about this? And if so, were you able to get any idea why they would cover this up? I mean, they must have some kind of idea what's going on. Either that or they just don't want to alarm the public so people would stop going to national parks.
So the perspective is that the average National Park Service employee is having a difficult life enough just doing their job day in and day out, and their vision of things is probably from 1,000 feet. You and I right now are rolling at 50,000 feet and looking at 350-plus different locations and seeing things from an entirely different perspective. The people, I would say, like I said, 99.5% of the Park Service doesn't have any fathom of a thought what you and I are discussing right now. And I don't blame them in the least for what's happening. It's that top realm in the Park Service that knows. One of the conversations I had was with the head of the Law Enforcement Bureau for the National Park Service. He kind of laughed and joked when I started to talk about the same things you and I are talking about here. Same thing. Well, Dave, people disappear. You know, it's not unusual. We deal with hundreds and hundreds of these events. And then they throw out this thing that you're going to hear many times, and I'm sure we're all going to hear it in the next few weeks. Do you know how many millions of people visit our park and have a safe trip? And I told him, I said, you know what? I know that is true, but the reality is that the Ayers family had their life ruined. The Dennis Martin family in the Great Smoky Mountains had their life ruined. The Trini Gibson family in the Great Smoky Mountains had their life ruined. The Dennis Johnson family in Yellowstone National Park had their life ruined. And you know what? I don't care if you had 20 million people there. Something happened to those kids, and they were never found inside your system. So to throw around big numbers like that you have so many millions of visitors, it only takes one to ruin your whole life, and that ruined these people's lives. And they have no advocates, and they're not on any database. Why?
It would be like the FAA saying, yeah, I know we had this terrible air disaster and a plane crashed and killed 200 people, but most planes don't crash. They land safely, you know.
Same analogy. Exactly.
The other part of that question was whether you were able to develop any confidential sources within NPS or former folks who worked for them.
So in Crater Lake, there's a cluster of young men and boys that have disappeared. And these disappearances go back nearly 100 years to an individual named B.B. Bukowski, who back when the park was just very, very young, he pulled a sled in the middle of winter and he's a landscape photographer, and he was taking photos of the lake. The first time anyone had ever done it during the winter. And Bukowski was a pretty strong guy. He built a snow cave. He had all of his equipment there. Inexplicably, he disappeared. And that kind of started the whole thing in Crater Lake. Well, when I was there, and when I tried to get the Park Service to release documents, and they ended up losing these years and years of docs, I found a note in a file in Medford in a newspaper about a ranger that worked there and was involved in the recovery of a body of one of these young men. And what it was an individual that was 19 years old visiting the lake, also during the winter, also a photographer.
Hey, David, I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm sorry. I didn't give you time enough to answer that. I apologize, but we'll pick up the story on the other side, and then we're going to get into specific cases and go down and cover as many of them as we can. Talking with David Paulides, author of the new book, Missing 411. I'm George Knapp. This is Coast to Coast AM. If you were listening Friday night, I was filling in for George Norrie, and I mentioned that I thought that this is the year of the 50th anniversary of the Beatles that we know, anyway, the Fab Four with Ringo joining the band, and sure enough, it is. It is the 50th anniversary of Ringo and the first hit. I thought it was Please Please Me. One of my astute listeners pointed out that was not released until the following year. But the first song that came out was in October of 1962, Love Me Do. That was their first hit. And I'm just wondering, where's the hoopla? 50 years of Beatles, that's pretty much most of my life. And you'd think there'd be a documentary and TV specials and a centennial album, or some sort of a celebratory album or something. Maybe we'll see that later in the year, but we're certainly going to be playing Beatles songs all the way through the rest of this year, at least when I'm hosting. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411, two-volume set about strange disappearances in national forests and national parks. We'll finish up the conversation about his ability to develop sources within the National Park Service, and then we jump right into the cases, and we're going to cover a heck of a lot of them. Stay with us. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. All right, David, before the break, I was asking you whether you succeeded in developing any confidential sources who had worked for the Park Service, and you were telling me about one particular cluster. Pick up the story from there.
So this is in Crater Lake, and a document that we discovered talked about one of the park rangers that had found a body out in the middle of the wilderness after this 19-year-old kid had disappeared. Again, this guy's name was Charles McCullough. He visited the lake by himself. Went there to photograph it during the winter. This happened in February of '75, and he disappeared. And at the time, his dad was on the East Coast, came out to Crater Lake, looked around, had the help of the Park Service, and was completely befuddled that his son could disappear in this lake at that time. In Crater Lake, imagine it as a giant volcano filled with water. You can't go down to the lake during the winter. The sides are very steep. There's 20-foot drifts of snow. It's an absolutely gorgeous place, but dangerous at the same time. So we found the name of a ranger. His name was Marion Jack, and Marion was a science teacher outside of Medford during the school year. And at the end of the school year, he went to the Law Enforcement Training Academy for the feds, became a law enforcement park ranger, and every summer he would take his family up to Crater Lake, and they would live there for the summer, and he was one of their law enforcement officers. Well, when McCullough disappeared, McCullough's dad came out, and he described for the Park Service the things that Charles should have with him. And there were some unusual things. First of all, there was a lot of camera equipment, a small backpack, a key for a Volkswagen, a very distinct type of Volkswagen key, and some other things. Well, a little more than a year after Charles disappears, about 12 miles from the point where he was at the lake, in the middle of the wilderness, and I mean in the middle of nowhere, some hikers are in a box canyon where a small creek goes in, and they see what they think is a skeleton. They eventually make their way out, and they bring some stuff with them that they found in the area, and what they found was a backpack, and they opened the backpack with the help of Marion and some other rangers, and they find this key, and right away they know that this is McCullough. So Marion, one of his jobs was to bring his horses up there for the summer, and he was one of the equestrian rangers, and so him and another ranger ride into this site, and he describes it as a long, rigorous, tough ride to get back in there. And making note, he said in February of '75, there were special notes in the report that there were 20-foot drifts of snow around the perimeter of the lake, making it literally impossible for anybody to get into the wilderness from the point that McCullough disappeared. Where he was found was in a canyon sort of thing with a small creek, not a big creek, very small, that ran in. And he said, I walked up to it. I ended up finding Marion, who lives in Southern Oregon, absolutely the greatest guy in the world, the kind of person you'd want being a park ranger. And he said, Dave, it's phenomenal that you were asking me about this case, because in 30 years of doing this, this is the strangest event I ever saw in my life. He says, myself and another guy walked into the canyon, and there was a large Douglas fir tree kind of branching the creek. And we walked up to it, and we kind of looked over the other side, and on the other side was a sight I'll never forget. And he said, imagine, Dave, that you're standing up and you melted into your jeans, your blue jeans. And he said, what we looked at was even more amazing, and that is that the jeans were sitting down on the bank, just like you would melt into them, except a more unusual sight. The pants were unbuttoned, and the belt was undone. And he said, the socks were inside the jeans as though they should be, and there were small bones in the socks as there should be, and there was one tibia on the right leg, that's the bone between the knee and the foot, which was broken, and there were no other bones. And he says, but a more disturbing sight, Dave, was that there were no boots. And he says, I've recovered dozens and dozens of bodies in the middle of the woods, and we always find the boots, because the boots don't blow away, animals don't take the boots, and there's something that can last 100 years. He says, but there's no boots. And he said, but the pants were there, but there's no shirt, there's no boots, there's no coat, there's no camera. He was carrying a knife, there's no knife, there's no nothing, except these small bones and a bone from a right knee. So in a circular pattern moving out from that area, they found the top of his skull 12 feet away, and a series of small bones, probably no bigger than an inch in circumference, around the entire area. Now, Marion says, Dave, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Something's wrong here. First of all, how McCullough got to this location in the middle of winter makes no sense. And what he's looking at right there makes zero sense. So what the rangers are taught to do in rural areas is call for an FBI ERT team, and that's an evidence response team, and they come from either Eugene or they come from Portland. So they secure the scene, they radio for an ERT team to come in and work this scene. So the FBI responds by helicopter with a group, and they end up working the scene for 4 days, Marion says. And he says, I know that the agents were befuddled, and everyone was wondering what was going on. And he goes, there were never really any good answers, Dave. But he says, FOIA the FBI and get the report. So I FOIA the FBI, and they send me some redacted report where you couldn't read 25 words on the whole page, and then they wouldn't send me the report on the crime scene or the crime scene diagrams. And what they did, and they do this every time, is they say that it would violate the privacy rights. I said, no, wait a minute. The person's dead. What privacy rights are we concerned about here? And the guy says, hey, that's our policy. You're not going to get it. I said, okay. So hold that thought for a minute regarding the open pants and the zipper down and the belt buckle undone. And if that's not strange enough, you would probably never hear this next point again in your life. So I asked Marion, I said, Marion, what do you make of this? She says, David, it makes no sense to me. The kid couldn't have gotten there in the middle of winter as far as we're concerned. He didn't have any snowshoes. He didn't have any skis. He didn't have anything for winter. And even if he did, I don't think he could have made it that far into the wilderness in the winter. There's no way. I says, okay. So during this 3-year search, son of a gun, if I don't come across a case equally as bizarre with the same sort of elements that I'm talking to you about here. And that is, in the Great Smoky Mountains, a kid disappears, a Boy Scout. He's on a trip through the Smokies, ended up falling behind and disappears. They search for him for a week, week and a half. Nobody can find him. Dogs can't search. They can't find him. It snows. And in the middle of a river, now this is a pretty big-sized river, searchers are next to the river, and they see a rock out in the middle, and there's a backpack laying on the middle of the rock as though somebody's taking inventory of things in the backpack. He goes, there's everything right there. And they can't figure this out because nobody in their right mind or even in their wrong mind would go in that river in the middle of winter. So they search, and they don't find anything. A couple more days later, they search a little more, and further upstream, further into the wilderness, in the middle of nowhere, they find this kid leaning against a tree. He doesn't have any shoes on, doesn't have a coat on, doesn't have a shirt on, and his pants are unbuckled, and they're pulled down to his knees. Now, asking the Park Service what they make of this, the common theme is, well, some people, when they suffer hypothermia, they take their clothes off. So I talked to some people that have been to the Himalayas. I said, how many climbers do you know of that have stripped naked when they get hypothermia? And they laughed, and they said, you're insane. I said, well, there's this theory going on out here in certain search and rescue circles that people do this when they get really cold, and they suffer hallucinations, and they actually get hot, and they take their clothes off. I go, hey, we don't see that here. Okay, well, maybe in some bizarre way, people get really hot, and they take their clothes off. Why would you drop your pants?
That's very strange. Since you're into the discussion of cases, let's start with the first one you mentioned in the book, and you already made a reference to it. This is something that happened in the Yukon Territory, and it's one of the cases that really got you hooked on it.
Yeah, Bart Schleier. Bart was a guy who is a mountain man to the max, but he's a smart guy. He was raised in the woods. His dad was a physician, but took Bart all over the world, to Africa hunting. He ended up working for the state of Montana in their bear program, tagging and releasing bear. He was in phenomenal condition. He actually went to Russia at one point and helped them tag and release bear. If there was anybody out there that was going to survive in the woods under any condition, it was Bart. And he always would look for more and more challenges. And he ended up going to the Yukon and the capital up there called Whitehorse. And this happened to be a story that riveted me because I've been to the Yukon a number of times. And it's very remote in certain regions. There's not a lot of ground cover in certain areas. Some areas of the Yukon have great fishing, some have no fish. Some areas have lots of moose, some have no moose. And Bart went to an area and was flown in. He set up a camp, brought supplies, and Bart would never hunt with a gun in North America. He always hunted with a bow and arrow. And he set up on the other side of the lake, and it appeared as though he was hunting for moose. Now, at about this time, I told a buddy of mine that owns a lodge up in the Yukon, I said, hey, do you know anybody in the western region of the Yukon that worked for natural resources? And my buddy of mine was a hunting and fishing guide, and he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. And he put me onto a man that had worked in the Yukon for 35 years, and son of a gun, he was on Schleier's crime scene, and they put me in touch with him. This guy said, Dave, son of a gun, 35, you hear this more and more, but he says, son of a gun, that's the strangest scene I've ever been in my life. He goes, where did you ever hear about this? I told him, it's through some work. Some friends told me that Bart had disappeared, and they were concerned. He said, concerned, this is one of the most peculiar cases I'm ever going to tell you about. He said, we got there because the pilot pulled up to pick Bart up and couldn't find him. And he had the creeps, and he left, and he told RCMP. So the RCMP come in there, and they did a superficial job and left, like less than an hour and a half. Yeah, they saw his stuff. Nothing was disturbed. The food was still there. Bears didn't attack the food. Nothing. They couldn't find him, and they left. Some of Bart's friends pay for a guy to fly him in there, and what they found disturbed them so much that they left. They got a contingent of RCMP, came back, and started to search the scene. So what happened was the search shows that Bart was probably sitting on this utility bag up near a tree, probably with his bow and arrow, waiting for a moose, calling it in. And somehow or another, something took him from behind. That's the assumption. So he was wearing a baklava over his head, and the baklava was found 25, 30 feet from the main area he was in, no blood on it. A pair of pants he was wearing was found near the scene, turned inside out, no blood, no bite marks on it. The entire area was very similar to what I just explained about McCullough. They found almost nothing of Schleier other than little teeny bones, a few teeth. That's about it. And the individual that I interviewed from the resources group in the Yukon said, Dave, first of all, bears in the Yukon don't eat their victims. They may attack them, but in 35 years, I never remember a bear actually consuming somebody to this point. The other point was that they found bear scat in the area. It was tested. There was no human remains in it, and there was no clothing in it. So Schleier's coat was gone, his gloves were gone, his shirt was gone, his pants were there, his boots were gone, and it was one of the biggest whodunits in the Yukon's history. And the more important point, and initially people will say, oh, a bear ate him or something, but there was food at the campsite that wasn't disturbed. And the resource guy could not say that it was a bear. He said, Dave, I don't think it was a bear, but I don't know what did do it.
You had you have a mention early in the book about a highway or a Trail of Tears kind of a place in British Columbia.
Yeah, I talk about it briefly, but I don't cover it. British Columbia, you and I could sit and talk about it for 8 hours and never cover everything adequately. Right up through the middle of British Columbia, there's a highway that's been nicknamed the Highway of Tears, and there's 50-plus Native American women that have disappeared. And the RCMP kind of poo-pooed the whole idea for a number of years until public sentiment got to the point that they had to do something about it. Now they have a RCMP task force working it, and they essentially have very, very little information about what's happening. They disappear. No, they're never seen with anybody. They're gone, and the numbers are phenomenal. Coupled with that, they have another disappearance going up there where feet inside shoes are showing up on beaches. And I know that they have only one case out of probably a dozen where they've identified the person. The other people, they don't even know who they are. And I'm talking about a single foot washes up on a beach with a shoe on it, and that's it. And for the people in California, actually one of these shoes with a foot in it rolled up on a beach in Crescent City not too long ago. Not much press about it, and I just heard about it because I was monitoring a site out of Eureka that had something in the news. But British Columbia is very, very strange. I did write a chapter about Vancouver Island, and Vancouver Island has some children that disappeared there, and some adults under the most bizarre conditions you can imagine. Again, in the middle of the woods, they're at a cabin. One girl, very young, disappears. She's found days and days later, 1,000, 2,000 feet uphill from the cabin, and the stranger thing is she's found underneath a log. And a lot of these kids are found in a place where the government is flying FLIR, forward-looking radar, trying to get a heat map of something on the ground, and they're never going to find it because they're under a log. And it just defies logic. And the parents on that one case in Vancouver Island, they stated that there's no way my daughter could have gone that way. There's no way my daughter would have walked that far, and there's no way she would ever leave the front of the cabin. She was afraid of her own shadow.
You hear the descriptions that you're giving us about these guys with their pants unbuttoned and their belt down, and then you hear about a bunch of women disappearing and then little kids disappearing. I'm thinking of the first thing that comes to mind is some sort of sexual predator, some kind of a psychopath that abducts people for sexual reasons and then leaves the remains or something. Why do you rule that out? I guess in general.
Right. And you got to think about this in general terms. So for an adult, let's say a Boy Scout, 15, 16 years old, who's 5'10" and 150 pounds, and he's walking with a group and he falls behind. Logically, it makes no sense that somebody could forcibly abduct anybody in the wilderness and make them to go anywhere with the number of people on trails, especially the Appalachian Trail where this Boy Scout disappeared. That's a pretty frequented trail. And then to force him down into an area where he would disrobe and purposely do acts that would cause a suicidal result. I mean, this replicates itself over and over and over again, sometimes even with hunters who are armed. So you got to think that can't be the logical end to it. There's got to be something else that is happening here that we don't understand. I don't think an average human is stealthy enough, quick enough, strong enough to force these type of things to occur.
Well, we're going to get into some specific cases that demonstrate that point. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411. A lot of creepy stuff still to come. I'm George Knapp. This is Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, 2-volume book, Missing 411. Going to stay with Canada for the next couple of minutes and then go down the West Coast. And it's amazing, to me anyway, how many of these cases occur in California. You think of California as very populous. There's people around, but there are some huge clusters in both ends of the state, and we'll be talking about those as we continue our conversation with David Paulides. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. A couple of other questions about Canada. You've mentioned now about the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and I was curious whether the attitude that you encountered with them on working with this stuff is different from what you encountered with the National Park Service here.
Well, Canada has a FOIA similar to us, but it only applies to Canadian citizens, so they don't have to do anything for us. And if it wasn't for archive searches to the max, we would have found nothing. And so, no, their attitude towards the U.S. is negligible. And having my buddies up in BC try to work it for me, they ran into worse problems than we had down here.
Huh. There's one case on Vancouver Island I want to touch on because it demonstrates some of the other truly weird aspects of this, and it's a young boy named Yehudi Pryor.
Yeah, Yehudi is again one of these cases where a young boy is doing something that you wouldn't think would be dangerous, and that is he's out in the woods and he's berry picking. And he's with his dad, and they're in an area called Wild Duck Lake, and they're out there just having the time of their lives. September 23rd, 1974. Kid's only 2 years old. He could barely walk. And as the father was picking the berries, he all of a sudden realized that Yehudi wasn't around. And he started looking, started calling the kid's name, couldn't find him. And he started to get more and more frantic, and he started screaming, and people started to come to the area, and before long, the RCMP was there with tracking dogs. They had helicopters. They had everything you'd have in a search. Nothing. And about 6 days after Yehudi first disappeared, a group was in really, really rugged bushland, very, very far outside the search parameters that you would look for a 2-year-old, and they found his body. And nobody could explain how he got there. Nobody could explain why he was there. And his dad said there's no way he could have gotten there. And the autopsy said he died of exposure. Now, this is going to be a common theme when you talk about kids who die in the wild. They're going to die of exposure. And a lot of times it's a catch-all for they can't figure it out. And there were no obvious signs of injury, but that's kind of the way it was, and it probably still is for kids who disappear. And there's other cases of kids with their parents berry picking and disappearing.
Berry picking, as if something is lurking in the berry bushes.
Well, yeah, and the first thought is, of course, okay, well, obviously you're challenging the bear for his place with the berries. But remember, when these kids are eventually found, there's no bite marks, there's no injuries, there's no nothing to them. They died of exposure, and they're found miles away, or they're found across a river, and there's no explanation of how they got there. And in most of these instances, the kid's either dead and can't explain it, 2 is too young and can't explain it, or 3 tells an amazing story that's baffling to researchers, law enforcement, and the press probably doesn't put the majority of the story in the paper because it's too hard to believe.
And in this case, with the Pryor boy, his father's right there. They're very close proximity. If a bear grabbed him, you're going to hear something.
Well, and like I said, this isn't the only time this has happened. If you just go south and west, or south and east just a little bit into the northern Cascades, there's a boy named Bobby Pankinen who disappeared in a cluster with other boys about anywhere between the ages of 4 and 9 years old, all within a 80 to 90 mile radius of one location in really, really rugged wilderness area. And in most of the instances, they're doing mundane things. They're berry picking. They're doing they're not doing strange things. They're just hanging out. Well, this one kid named Wesley Piatote, berry picking with his mom. These are Native Americans. They're in the rugged wild. His mom hears a muffled scream and starts running towards him. She hears a second scream, louder, and she starts really running. And now everyone's running. He disappeared. The kid was never found. Now, the way I explain this in the book is a scream is one of the last gestures you're ever willing to make or ever can make before you view it as the end. You don't have enough time to explain, hey, help me, I'm falling. A scream is something abrupt and major, and it's the last thing that they'll usually hear. And there's a couple of these stories in both books where parents hear a scream of the kid and they disappear and they're never found. Now, in the same radius, in the same area, and it's near Wenatchee, Washington, that a lot of these things occurred. A little boy named Jimmy Duffy was in a camper with his sister while his parents walked around the outside of this camper, and they went there for the weekend. Parents are about 200 yards from the camper, and they have it in view. Short period of time, they walk behind a couple trees. They both hear a scream. They run around the outside of the trees. The back of the camper's open. They don't see anything. They run as fast as they can into the camper, and they look inside. The daughter is still asleep, and their cat is still inside, and Jimmy is gone. A massive search of this area, the boy is never found. Now, this is a really interesting case because the sheriff lost the case file, and he put it under his wing, and he worked for weeks, him and another clerk, and they found the case file, and they sent it all to me. And it's now open again, but it wasn't. And the interesting part about this case is that the detectives working it initially accused the parents. And I mean, they drilled these parents hard. And eventually they got Seattle PD to do polygraph exams on both of them and cleared them both. Now imagine this, George. You lose your son in the middle of nowhere. You spend the next 2 or 3 weeks defending yourself as detectives are honing in on you. In the meantime, nobody's looking for your son, and your son is never found. By the time you're exonerated, the trail's closed. That's it. And what I'm telling you about these boys missing up north, I guarantee nobody's put this together.
The other thing about the prior case that I don't want to beat a dead horse here or something, but the body was found in an entirely different valley. This kid's 2 years old. There is no way that he walks all that distance under his own power. It's as if he's like transported or something.
Exactly. And that's an ongoing theme. They're found in areas that don't make sense. They're found outside search parameters. And again, not slightly outside, I mean way outside.
And sometimes found in areas that have been thoroughly searched over and over.
That happens multiple times. Sometimes they're found in the middle of a trail where searchers are going. It's almost as though some intelligent entity puts them in a location knowing that searchers are going to find them. It's like you're gone for a while. Okay, now we don't need you, but now we're going to put you in a place where we know that you're going to get found. And they put you there, and the searchers find them. And then they're baffled. They say, we searched this area 30 times. We go up and down this trail every day. And then they're found, and there's no marks on them per se, except every once in a while, especially in the East Coast edition, the kids are found, and they're scratched badly. And I addressed that a little bit. It happened in Arizona a lot with a cluster of young boys that also disappeared. And in the newspapers, they say they were horribly scratched to the point of almost being gored. And in the newspaper articles, it says, well, it's obvious that they were walking through the bush with no care for themselves. And I said, and I explain this in the book, and I say, a 3 or 4 year old or a 5 or 6 year old, they're not going to randomly walk through needles and thorns and berry bushes and just horribly scratch themselves up. If it gets that bad, I think they're going to sit down and just wait. But I don't think that a small boy or a small girl is going to just randomly walk through this stuff and just tear their body up. That's not the mentality.
Along the same lines, you have several cases in the book where the kids will walk not only an incredible distance, but up. That they, they're lost, presumably, wandering around in the wilderness, and they start climbing a mountain as opposed to going down.
And that's something that initially, when I read about these, I thought, well, okay, that's a one-time random occurrence, and I can guarantee that the search and rescue teams that are working these cases never think to even go outside these parameters to the degree that sometimes they have to. And some of the young, it's usually boys under the age of 5, disappear. And there was a case out of Mono, California, Inyo Kern County region, just outside of Yosemite National Park on the eastern side. A small boy disappears, and him and his family are vacationing with their camper at a region right near a lake. And the kid, they're looking for him for a couple of days, and they bring in some fresh dogs. And this is one of those strange times where the dogs start going uphill. And I'm not talking a little hill. This is a huge hill. And what I write in the book is that because I went to this area, and as you walk up this hill, and I walk 100 feet up, but I'm huffing and puffing, and I turn behind me, and I have a full view of the campsite where this kid disappeared, and the lake, because there's nothing on this hillside. It's super steep. So he hikes up at 3,000 feet, but the kid's not done. He goes over the top of that mountain, down into a valley, and he starts hiking the next mountain. And now he's going up 4,000 or 5,000 feet. And the way this was found is a dog actually bit on the trail and started going up the hill. Middle of the night, they stopped, and I'm sure that the searchers thought this is insanity. And that's why they called it the night, and they went back. The next day, they bring in Army personnel to help them search. And an Army sergeant is 2 mountains, and we're not talking hills, we're talking mountains away near a peak on the outskirts of Yosemite. And he goes around a boulder, and he finds this boy dead laying on the ground. And when the reporter interviewed the soldier, he asked him, he says, were there any visible injuries? And the soldier commented that, I couldn't make a determination on that. Now, you and I know that if we walk up on a body and we don't see anything, we're going to be able to say, hey, there were no visible injuries that I saw. Yet if he were told to just keep his mouth shut and not talk about it, he's probably going to say, well, I really don't know, and I really can't comment about that, which was kind of the statement the sergeant made. And it was, again, it's one of those cases 5,000 times outside search parameters. The kid was naked. He didn't have any shoes on. Again, no comment about the feet. It's a totally bizarre story.
Talk to me for a moment about cases where the victims, the person that vanishes or disappears, is found alive. I mean, you mentioned several examples of kids who are found somewhere alive, but it seems like the ones who come back are all too young to be able to explain where they were or what happened to them, or they have mental problems and can't express themselves.
And that is a very strange part of this story, and I talk about it in both books. At the beginning, you start to think, well, maybe these kids with disabilities, because of that disability, disappeared. Because of their inability to think logically like you and I, they disappeared. But when you get into the minutia of the data, there's too many for it to be a random chance like that. And it's too coincidental that they disappear under the circumstances that they do. There's one case where a small boy, again, disappears. Searchers look for him for days. He's not found. And when he's eventually found, again, found so far outside the search parameters as it's ridiculous, again, found without any clothing. The mom and dad come over, they view the body, and the searchers say, well, he probably had hypothermia and he took his clothes off. This is one of those cases where the parents said, hey, nix on that. My kid couldn't take his clothes off. He couldn't dress himself. So under that scenario, there wasn't one mention in the search and rescue report or in any law enforcement document about how they can reconcile that.
It's almost as if the ones who survive, or at least a lot of the children who survive and are found because they can't talk. It's almost like, well, I can let this one go. He can never explain it to anybody.
And that's what logic would tell you. And somehow or another, whoever, whatever is happening here has some knowledge of what's going on with that person before they take them. It's beyond my understanding. But it's too coincidental, and it happens too frequently for it to be chance.
I'm going to jump out of geographical order here while we're talking about kids, because there is one case in the Missing 411 Eastern U.S. book, a Michigan case that you highlighted and mentioned to me because you knew it would be of interest to me in particular, about this girl named Katie Flynn in Michigan, 3 years old. That
case is one of the most, how would you describe it?
I don't know. It's kind of chilling, and it goes to the heart of a mystery that I've sort of pursued on my own. But go ahead and tell it.
So in 1868, in northern Michigan, near a city called Walhalla, her dad, a guy named Henry Flynn, ran a lumber camp. And his daughter was 3 years old, could just walk, and couldn't walk too well. But she would, up this hill, the dad would get trees and do the milling, etc. And then the horses would drag the cart with the lumber down to the bottom of the hill, and Katie would get off, and then she'd run back to the top of the hill for another ride down. And I don't know how many times a day she did this, but she did it a lot. And at one point, the dad went back to the top of the hill, and Katie wasn't there. And he started to get frustrated, and he started looking around, and in a very, very odd coincidence, as they're running around looking for Katie, 2 hunters show up. And everyone's screaming, looking for Katie, blah, blah, blah. And these hunters start helping Mr. Flynn look for his daughter. So as they're searching, they hear this kind of, it was described in the article as a feeble cry inside dense, dense brush miles from where they were. And as they walk up on this little cry, they see what they think is a giant bear jump from the location where Katie was at into the river and absolutely fly through the river and disappear. So when Mr. Flynn gets his daughter, he says, when we were calling you, why didn't you come back to us? And she said, it wouldn't let me. And Mr. Flynn says, what do you mean it wouldn't let you? Mr. Wolf wouldn't let me. And he goes, well, what do you mean Mr. Wolf wouldn't let you? He says, what happened to your hat? And she says, the wolf ate it. And he goes, what do you mean the wolf ate it? He took it off my head and he ate it in front of me. And he says, well, did you get anything to eat? And she says, yeah, the wolf got some berries for me and put it in its paw and handed it to me. And Mr. Flynn's a pretty smart guy, just like you and I are really brilliant. Well, gee, a wolf couldn't hold berries in its hand. But she was pretty adamant that it was a wolf. And this goes on, and there's a couple different stories over the years that don't wander too far from what was told, but in general, the story is pretty convincing that the way Katie described it probably happened pretty similar to that.
I think in the book you use the term big dog instead of wolf.
Yeah,
that's what caught my attention. Dog heads on animals, and big dog came up to me, took me in his arms, and walked away with me.
Yeah.
And then he also laid down and made a little shelter for her, and they laid down and spent some time there. Yeah,
and cuddled with her and kept her warm.
Not like any big dog or bear I've ever heard of.
No. But I don't mind saying it, that, I mean, when I was reading this, because I try to read a lot, I mean, that northern Michigan area kind of has a notation for being dogman area. And
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And this is kind of falls in line with that, but kind of strange.
I also notice that the Uinta Basin, and we're not going to have time enough to get into it before the break, but the Uinta Basin, which I've been to a lot of times and investigated some other strange stuff, is one of the clusters that you cover in the book, as well as several in California. Maybe we'll just put it this way, and then when we hear the music, we'll go to a break. But California, you think of it as, it's the most populous state in the nation, millions and millions of people. We forget about how vast the state is and how much wilderness there is, and as you document, a lot of people disappear in these areas, both ends of the state. You have clusters at both ends.
That's correct. The area around the LA Basin has a series of kids that have disappeared in very strange circumstances. You go all the way to the northern sector of the state around Mount Shasta. There's another cluster there. There's a cluster in the Sierras right around Yosemite that some of the stories just defy anybody's conventional explanation of what happened.
We'll get into those clusters in California right after this break. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411. Stay with us, everyone. This is Coast to Coast AM. So glad you're with us tonight, everyone. We're having one heck of a conversation with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411s. We've already heard some very, very strange cases, and there's still more to come. In the next hour, of course, we'll be opening up the phone lines. If there's anybody who's worked for the Park Service, any rangers out there, any law enforcement folks who want to chime in on this, you might have a different take on it. I hope you'll give us a try and call in the next hour. Our conversation picks up right where we left off, right after this. And if you think the cases you've heard so far are pretty weird, you haven't heard anything yet. Much more to come on Coast to Coast. Stay with us. Some of these cases, Dave, are just heartbreaking. Children and elderly people who disappear. Their families are just crushed by the disappearance, racked with guilt. As you mentioned, they become suspects themselves in some cases. I think this case of Keith Parkins, a little 2-year-old who disappeared in Oregon, I think, and it kind of demonstrates a lot of the characteristics that you've already told us about. Tell us about Keith Parkins.
So Keith went with his folks to visit his grandparents' farm outside of Ritter, and that's sort of near the Washington border, northern Oregon. And it's near the Umatilla National Forest. and it's right on the fringe of the Bridge Creek Wildlife Area. Now, one of the things in both books that you'll find is that unusually large number of these kids will disappear while they're visiting the grandparents' residence. And the grandparents live in rural areas. And that's what happened with Keith. And it's not clear from the clippings exactly what happened, other than he was there, he was in the yard, and he disappeared. And at about the time he went missing, the grandfather knew the area well, et cetera, and according to search and rescue, it says, 95% of the time a 1 to 3-year-old is going to be found within 2 miles of a rural location, such as where Keith disappeared. Well, an April 10th, 1952 article in Lewiston Daily stated that the boy was found over a dozen miles away from the grandparents' home 19 hours after he disappeared, and he was found unconscious laying in a creek bed. Okay, so that's a little odd because he had to go over 2 mountain ranges, fences, creeks, rivers, and this this little boy who was 2 years old, barely could walk, and he was found 12 miles away. Now think about this for a second and say, okay, even under the best conditions, could you and I go 12 miles through the mountains in 19 hours? I don't know.
I don't think I could. I'm pretty darn sure I could not.
And this little boy's found unconscious on the verge of death when he's found. Now, when we sat down and discussed this case, it's odd, yes, but what's even more odd to us is that the searcher was that far out looking for him. And we couldn't figure out why he was. And it doesn't make any sense unless somehow or another they had some suspicion that something really weird happened to be out that far 19 hours later. Because at 19 hours, you're hugging pretty close to the point where the person was last seen, and you're not wandering too far away. You slowly, just the way search and rescue goes, you start close and you start fanning out. Why the searchers were 12 miles out at 19 hours is the million-dollar question. But again, it happened, almost 50 years ago, and it's hard to get any real clear answers. But yeah, you're right. This is one of those ones that's a major whodunit how it happened. And the other point is that a lot of these kids are found in creek beds and river beds, and a lot of times they're dry creek beds and river beds. And when you start to try to think through this and say, well, why would they be there? Well, if there was water in it, maybe they're trying to get water. But also a creek bed and a river bed is an area that doesn't give up a lot of evidence of who was there. There's a lot of rocks and things, so it's hard to determine what kind of footprints and things you can get on rocks.
In general, though, you're not finding footprints of any kind, not animal prints, not human prints in these cases, nothing that indicates that somebody was abducting a kid or someone, the other victims, walking alongside their prints?
Well, so you have to remember the search mentality. They're not thinking abduction during these times. They're thinking recovery, and that's their main agenda. And I'm not laying any fault on them at all. But it's part of that mindset. If I was out searching with the knowledge now I have, I would go out there with a different mindset. And when I did find the victim, I would look at that location entirely different than search and rescue personnel do. I could guarantee that none of these cases are thought of as abduction, or very, very few. And it's only when there's hindsight involved and they start to put all of the parameters together that law enforcement will ever start to think that maybe that there is an abduction or there was a kidnapping. And there are cases that I talk about in the book where some really smart law enforcement guys got together, and in the paper they even said this doesn't make sense. It's got to be some kind of abduction that we don't understand. Now in this case, there was never any talk of that. But there was also never any explanation about how a 2-year-old could go 12 miles through the mountains.
One other case in Washington I want to touch on, Bobby Panknin, 4 years old. Remember this one?
Oh yeah, that one's one of those ones that happened in the Cascades amongst all these other boys. And Panknin was with his family, and they were on a vacation, and they were in an area near a resort when the mom and 2 of the boys decided that they were going to take a hike up a logging road. And Panknin was young, and he didn't walk real well, and he wasn't even wearing shoes. And they were walking up this area that was rugged, tough, and they were trying to get to a waterfall. And the mom got directions, and the boys and her went up there, and they eventually get to the waterfall. And she tells the one young boy, she goes, "Hey, I want you to just stand right here out on the roadway, and I'm going to go inside this area with your brother, like 20 feet away, and we're going to take a look at the waterfall, and I'll be right back." And it's not a very long trip, and there's no place to go. That was the safety factor behind leaving Bobby where he was. And after a short period of time, the mom and the other boy come out. Bobby's gone. And this started an absolutely massive search that went on for days and days. And eventually, the end wherewithal was that the sheriff said, well, maybe he got picked up by an eagle. And I know we kind of giggle and laugh about that now, but I've heard this several times on disappearances years and years ago. And the reality of that is that I'd have to be a pretty big eagle to pick up a 4-year-old boy. And the mom was so close, she never heard anything. And they brought in tracking dogs. Dogs never picked up a scent. Dogs never really figured anything out. They trailed for a little bit. They eventually gave up. And again, after reading so many of these, it kind of sounded like the dog didn't want to search.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that the sheriff brought in a bloodhound, gave the scent from the boy's shoe, and the dog takes off at a dead run for a couple of miles, and then what? He comes to a fork in a road and just kind of stops.
Yeah. That happens more times than not. That's happened in Colorado at Rocky Mountain National Park, where they come to a fork and he stops. Now, when I say a fork in the road, this logging road wasn't in operation. It was in horrible shape. It was more of a walking trail. And the mom even said to the investigators that there's no way anything came up the road, I would have heard it. And it wasn't in condition that it could have been driven on. Obviously, it was just some kind of trail, but that's a pretty big indicator when a dog just stops and won't go on.
You quote the father as saying something in a newspaper, a quote he gave to the newspaper, his thoughts about his lost son. He says, "It's as if Bobby climbed to the top of a tree and then kept on going."
Yeah. Yeah, it's...
And you theorize in the case summary that it was as if someone was watching the family?
Well, if you think about this, and in hindsight, you think about this scenario with all of these cases, because in many times the brevity that the victim is left in, it's not like this kid was left for 30 minutes. I think he was left for 7 or 8 minutes. There wasn't the time for a casual occurrence to happen where somebody just happened to walk by and grab. Somebody had to be, or something happened to be watching, saw the opportunity, and took it. And the opportunity in all of these cases is so minimal that it's almost like somebody was watching. Whatever was watching. I don't know.
There's a case you mentioned about a guy named, an older kid, 17 years old, Corey Fay. This is Oregon, I think, or maybe it was Washington. That was very disturbing, very unusual in a lot of ways. What jumps out at you about this case?
Yeah, that is one of those cases where a rational thought doesn't come to your mind when you think about Corey. He was a hunter, and he was with another group, and there were some innuendos on that case where there might have been some foul play involved. But I really, in looking at this case, I don't think so, because it falls within the realm of everything else we've talked about: location, altitude, etc. So Faye's hunting, and a lot of these people disappear while they are elk hunting. And elk hunting seems to be one of those things, for whatever reason, that a lot of people disappear. And, it could be weather, maybe not, but in Corey's case, it wasn't. He was 17 at the time. He'd hunted a few times. He was well-equipped. And he was hunting right there on the Oregon-Washington border. He disappears. They have a massive search. Wasco County sheriffs come in. The Rocky Mountain Search and Rescue Team actually came out from Salt Lake. And across a ridge line, they find a series of tracks much higher than where Corey should have been. and it had started to snow at that time, and they saw the tracks on this ridgeline. And it was perplexing to everybody involved why Corey would be on the top of the ridge in a snowstorm when all he had to do was look at the valley below and see there was no snow. It would make sense that you would go lower in elevation to get warmer. And during that time that searchers were working, they heard some unusual things around the area. There were some sounds that they couldn't. Initially, they thought it was screams, but then sometimes they would get some kind of faint response going back and forth. And it was confusing to searchers because initially they thought it might be Corey, but then later on they said it couldn't have been. And they eventually went out and they found a tooth that they thought was Corey's, and that's about all that they recovered. And this was after a massive search, and it was perplexing because it falls into that realm where they also didn't find any boots. And again, like I've said before, boots are heavy. Where were Corey's boots? And no skull. There were very few bones, one tooth. And as I said in the book, this case falls in line with Schleier's case and Huggins' case up in Ontario and McCullers' case in the Crater Lake area. And if you read some search and rescue logs and some news articles on this event, they try to point to a possible crime that occurred out there. Maybe he was shot and killed and things. But when you understand the crime scene and you compare this crime scene to others that I've described, there starts to be some parallels. The other parallel in this event, along with many others I describe in both books, is at the time that the person disappears, the weather is okay. And soon after the disappearance, and I'm talking real soon, sometimes within hours, the weather turns really, really bad. And right away, I mean, a lot of listeners will think, okay, well, that kind of went along with the search and rescue problems and why the person wasn't found. Well, in Corey's case, he went up higher in elevation than he should have been, and common sense would have said he should have been coming down. And where the location where they found the tooth and some other things, it doesn't make any rational sense in the least. And in the book, I tell people, well, in Corey's case, there's no boots, socks, pants. Why would he remove his coat? He was a search and rescue trained person that in inclement weather he knew what to do. He walked 3 miles, they figure, in waist-deep snow on a ridgeline when he could have walked downhill and gotten warmer. Why would he be 10 miles? He was eventually found 10 miles from where he should have been and where he should have met up with his friends. And the other point of this that never made any sense is that the sheriff told the news people that came to cover this that he didn't think there was any crime. So what he did do is he calls the FBI in the middle of this, and they start to help out and look around, and what's called monitoring the case, but not essentially taking the case. But there's never anything discussed other than that. And I think it might be a good point to tell the listeners that in many of these cases, the FBI shows up and monitors the case. And this is an important point because the FBI has some of the best profilers in the world that take all of the information that is found at a scene. And it doesn't have to be, per se, a crime scene, an unusual scene. And they take this and they put it in a database and they search it when they need to. And maybe one time finding just bones or small bones won't be important. But the 10th or the 11th time, it starts to put together a series of events that are unusual. Now, the FBI lists on their website the cases they handle and the cases they won't handle. And they don't handle missing persons cases. But unusually, one category is unusual disappearances of children. Now, why would that be something? And when you look at the massive amounts of cases that I've listed in these books, where there's a consistency in the elements of what happened and how they were found, what I write is I say, the FBI are some of the best profilers in putting information together and putting a string together so it makes sense. We'll never see this. But every time an FBI agent goes on a scene, even though they're just monitoring, they're writing a report, and that's going in. That's going into their database for more knowledge later on. These people are brilliant at doing these things. And they know much more about everything I'm talking about than you and I will ever know about what they're monitoring. And
we're going to go to a break. I'm sorry, we're going to go to a break in about 2 minutes. I'd like to ask you this, and I know maybe it's not enough time to. Does it seem like something is eating these people? I mean, you mentioned about the bone fragments and the skulls and the kinds of remains that are found in some of the cases. Many of the cases, nothing is found, and the clothes, all that stuff. Does it seem like they're being consumed just by no kind of animal that we know of?
Some search and rescue people and some woodsmen will say, oh, small animals ate the bones and broke them up into small pieces like that. Other people say, no, that's not happening, and that's not what is going to happen here. And because the pants are turned inside out and the way that the remains were scattered in a confined area, it doesn't make sense. So some woodsmen would say no, some would say yes, but the people that were on the scene, the experienced people, when they start to call an evidence response team, I don't think that's normal.
Well, and when you talk about the FBI, what has been the response from them in terms of when you've tried to get records through FOIA?
They are the worst of the worst. They will give you essentially nothing.
On the grounds that maybe it's still an open case, or what's the reason
even
they
if the
use?
person's deceased, what they're saying is, and it doesn't make any sense, is that they'll violate the privacy rights of the victim.
Oh, that's right.
And it completely befuddles you. How could they have privacy rights? They're deceased.
Speak for the next minute, and then we'll go to the break, about California in general. How many clusters in California?
So California has 3.5. One is evolving right now just north of Lake Tahoe, where 3 people have disappeared kind of in the Oroville area up in the mountains between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. But one is Mount Shasta, far northern California. One's Yosemite, and the other one is around the L.A. Basin. And again, the L.A. Basin disappearances, it's hard to find relevance to the population in L.A., to the disappearances of these kids in the middle of nowhere. And I know some people probably can't understand that who have never been to the mountains, but very quickly in the in the Angeles National Forest and the area above Ventura and Santa Barbara, you can get really remote really quick, and these kids have just vanished sometimes in areas that are that remote.
You hear that, Nathan? Nathan's our engineer who goes camp. Okay, Gary, you're aware of that? You go camping there all the time, so I got to be careful. Maybe somewhere along the line tonight we can give advice, David, about if parents have kids going into these areas where there are known clusters, what kind of precautions they could take or should take. Obviously, they're not taking them, or we wouldn't have quite this many disappearances. We'll be back with more case studies, particularly in California, from David Paulides, author of the new book, Missing 411. Plenty more to come. Stay with us, everyone, for Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with David Paulides about his book, Missing 411. When we come back, we get into some of the California clusters, in particular Mount Shasta, which is where we'll start. A lot of weird stories about Mount Shasta over the years. They're about to get weirder. Stay with us, everyone. A lot more to come on Coast to Coast AM. David, let's talk about Mount Shasta. A lot of weird stories over the years, Lemurians and underground cities and things of that sort, flying saucer sightings, all kinds of strangeness. But you've been able to find in focusing on disappearances that strange things have been going on there for a long time. There was a whole cluster back in the 1800s, right?
Yeah, so the cluster is defined in our mind as a geographical cluster up to a 100-mile radius. And there's a consistent thread that runs through those disappearances. We'll talk about 60 miles west of Mount Shasta as you go towards the coast. There's a small town called Gasquet. It's Gasquet, French name. And in the old days, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a series of miners that had 50 to 100 mines scattered throughout the perimeter of the Marble Mountain Wilderness area and the region bordering Oregon. So in the late 1800s, everyone sort of kept track of everybody. And slowly, the miners started to disappear. And I don't mean they came into town and they dropped their belongings, sold them, and took off. I mean they disappeared. people would find the mine, but there was nobody there. Their belongings were there. Their guns were there. They were gone. And there were up to 30 of these miners that disappeared in the late 1800s, early 1900s that were never found. No graves. They weren't robbed. They were gone. And this was noted in the Crescent Valley newspaper at the time, and as an oddity. So you fast a lot of the clusters that I write about. There's a historical tie, as there is in Crater Lake, to disappearances. This isn't a phenomenon that's just occurred in the last 10 years. This has usually occurred over a long-term period of time. So in the Mount Shasta cluster, it's tied to this coastal region near Gasky where the miners vanished. Well, in Mount Shasta, then there's two highly, highly unusual events that occurred in 1999 and in 2000. And they both involved older people, a guy named Carl Landers, who was 69, and an individual named Rosemary Kunst, who was 70. Different events, different locations. Carl was with some buddies that he had known for a number of years, and they wanted to climb Mount Shasta. And understand that Mount Shasta is climbed hundreds and hundreds of times, and you don't need to be a star athlete to do it. It's a tough climb, but you can do it. And Carl was with some friends, and one of them was a retired airline pilot who flew fighters or flew in the Air Force and was a really well-rounded person, and another individual who ran an import business out of San Francisco. So they left. They started to climb the mountain, and they stopped in an area where everyone stops before they make the final ascent, and it's in an area of a small lake. Well, that night they didn't quite make the lake. They set up their little tent in a little cove up against the mountain near some boulders. And they spent the night there sleeping away, and it got a little windy. And Carl wasn't feeling 100%. He had some diarrhea that they thought might be due to the altitude pills that he was taking for acclimating to the conditions. But he left the tent a couple of times for diarrhea. He came back, and early in the morning, he said he didn't feel good, but he could still make it. So even though these guys were older, they were pretty good athletes. Carl used to run every day, and he was a good athlete, although he hadn't made this climb before. Others with him had. So early in the morning, they're picking up the tent, and two of the guys who were picking up the tent told Carl, hey, go around the turn, go 800 feet, and you're going to hit the lake, wait there, and we'll be right there. And if you understand the area, there's one very, very defined trail that runs along the side of Shasta that goes straight to the lake. There is nothing else you can do. There are no other choices. It is very evident where you're going, etc. Carl says, okay. The guys, 15, 20 minutes later, get the tent done. They take off. They head around the corner and go to the lake. They get to the lake, and there's a ranger assigned there because there's so many people that camp at this lake at night before they ascend. And he kind of keeps track of everybody. And they stopped at the ranger, and they said, hey, did you see this guy? And he says, no. They say, you sure? Well, there's only one guy that took off, and they saw this guy up the hill, and they knew that wasn't Carl. So they walked back and forth 3 or 4 times, and then one of them decided to go up the mountain a little further. Make a long story short, they finally give up, and, by the way, Carl had left his supplies, along with a lot of other guys left their supplies with that tent in that area. So they went back, and all the tents and sleeping supplies were still at that area where they had left it. And so they decided, well, they better get some help. And so they called Shasta County Search and Rescue. They called California Search and Rescue. And a very grisly guy named Grizz Adams was running the search operations. He'd been doing this for 30 years. I spoke to Grizz about this personally. I met with him. And again, it's one of those times he goes, Dave, how did you ever hear about this story? This 35 plus years, I've never had this happen to me. He says, we were all over that mountain. He goes, Carl was not on the mountain, Dave. We brought canines in. They didn't pick him up. We flew it. We dropped guys at the summit, 14,000 plus feet. They came down all sides. They couldn't find him. They talked to people who were on the mountain. They didn't see him. He said, Dave, there's snow around the path where he was, and nobody went outside the path. I said, what happened to him, Grizz? He says, Dave, it's $1 million question. He either went up or he went in, but he's not on it. And Carl Landers, to this day, has never been found. They never found a piece of his. He was carrying climbing equipment, boots, an axe, all the things that a climber would have who would go up Shasta. None of that stuff was ever found. His car was still at the bottom. It's one of the greatest whodunits ever found anywhere in that area. The other one involves a woman named Rosemary Kunst. Disappeared August 18th in 2000. She was 70 years old. Rosemary went through a pretty tough portion of her life. Her and her husband, a few years before that, were in an accident, and the husband died in the accident. She was looking for some type of spiritual retreat and getting into the mountains, and she found a Native American organization that gave tours up to a lake in the Marble Mountain Wilderness called Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake is a very gorgeous setting. Sits somewhat in a bowl area with a lot of trees on one end, no trees at the other end. Almost looks like, again, a little small volcano. And she went up there with a handful of other people and a Native American chief. And they went up there for, I forgot if it was 3 or 4 days. But during the time, the Native Americans would bring everyone to the altar at night, and they would sing spirit dances. And they would talk to the gods, and the people supposedly had this event happen to them where they can talk to their spirits, and she could reach out to her husband, etc. And the next day, after this event, the chief said that he was going to take a group over to another lake short distance away, and Rosemary said that she was going to stay behind. And the chief's son, who was 12 years old then, she asked the boy, hey, do you want to go with me over to the other side of the lake and have a picnic? And the boy says, no. Well, the cook that was there, she asked the cook if he would make her a lunch, and she would be back after she ate the lunch. He said, no problem. He made the lunch. She said goodbye to the boy, and she walked around this perimeter of the lake. Now understand, you and me and nobody else is going to walk outside the perimeter of this lake. The sides of it are very steep, rugged, etc. You stay inside the confines. There's no place to go. They all see her walk inside the bowl and go to the other side, and they lose her in a series of trees. 4 or 5 o'clock comes back. Everyone arrives back at camp, and Rosemary's not back. So they send a couple people out to look, and they don't find anything. It's like she was never there. And they come back. The Native American chief gets out a sat phone and calls for help. The cavalry arrives, and they start to search. And this is another Grizz Adams search. Grizz says, Dave, damn, these are the 2 times in my career where I have no answers. And he said, this woman, we talked to the family, she was mentally in great health. And this is a point that everyone should remember. She asked the boy to go with her to have the picnic, so you know that she was not suicidal. Even if she was suicidal, there's no place to go. If she drowned, they would have found her in the lake. She wasn't in the lake. She couldn't have gotten outside the confines, and even if she did, they would have found her because there's nothing but huge boulders on the other side. There's one outlet where the lake dumps into this small little ravine that's extremely steep going down the other side. And Grizz said they had guys in mountain gear going down looking inside boulders on this cliff. Dogs never reacted to anything. They couldn't find her. They never did find her. It's another one of those cases where there's nothing.
Well, you have a whole bunch of them from Mount Shasta, Mount Lassen National Park. There was one that caught my eye, Greta Mary Gale. This girl is 30 months old at the time of her disappearance. She's playing with some other kids in the front yard and just vanishes. 2 days later, they find her. They finally found her on the side of a mountain. How far away? Do you remember how far away from where she had been taken?
It was quite a distance, but the more important fact behind it is that she was up on the side of this mountain laying next to a boulder, and I've been to this place many times. If you looked at that mountain, you would think, why would anybody go up there? There's nothing there. And unless she was hiding under this boulder, they would have seen her from the air, and they didn't see her. And the sad part about this is she was with her grandparents vacationing, and when she disappeared, her grandfather, who was a congressman at the time, had a heart attack and died.
When they found the girl, though, what you write is that she had basically no clothes on. She was wearing only panties. It had got down to 25 degrees, and somehow she survived out there in these freezing temperatures. It was as if she went somewhere else, and then somebody dropped her back off.
So this is probably a good time to talk about something that I'm sure your listeners have keyed on, and I'm sure they're asking themselves, they're saying, why aren't these fools thinking of this? It's something called paradoxical undressing, and we've heard about this 1,000 times while we research this. And the name in itself implies that it is a paradox. Why would these people be taking off their clothes in the situations that they are? And there's theories out there that this is something that you go through when you're hypothermic, and that's why the people are taking off the clothes. Well, what I tell you is that there are several cases that we investigated where there's no way the people had hypothermia at the time they disappeared, because the clothes were found hundreds of feet from the location they disappeared. It's not like they were gone hours and hours. It's like they got out of view, the clothes came off, and away they went. So I don't think paradoxical undressing applies.
You've had great success in developing good, trusting relationships with Native Americans, the Hoopa tribe that you investigated, Bigfoot sightings and things of that sort. I'm curious, and you just mentioned one particular Native American chief. Were you able to talk to them about the general premise? Is there anybody who gave you any insight into what the heck is going on? Do they have a take on it?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm the chief that was running the event where the lady disappeared at Spirit Lake, Rosemary. He was equally perplexed, but he did say that he thought that Rosemary wanted to go back. And he said that there was a point where he was at the lake and two eagles flew over together, and to him that indicated that she was back with her husband. And I said, well, where do you think she went? And he said, I think she went to a place called Devil's Back Mountain, which brings up another point that I talk about in both books. There are several times where people disappear in an area where it has a strange name. And for anyone who knows a lot about the mountains or mapping, locations on maps get names for a reason. And, if it's Mill Creek, there's probably a mill on that creek at one time. If it was Frank's Pass Creek, well, Frank Pass may have lived on that creek 100 years ago. Well, there's a couple times in this book, well, many times, where Devil's Valley, Devil's Mountain, Devil's Nest, these are the places where people are disappearing. And I say in the book, the reason it has that name is for a reason. Now, I don't understand the reason most of the time, but I do know that these names come up way too frequently. And when the chief said that Rosemary disappeared and probably went to Devil's Back Ridge, I'm thinking, wow, is that coincidental?
Did you come up with any cases in the areas where you've concentrated your work before, the Hoopas, for example?
Surprisingly, the area where the miners disappeared is in fairly close proximity to the Hoopa on the Yurok tribe and the Karuk tribe. There's sort of three tribes that all live in the same general area. Hoopa has really the only city and reservation per se, but the Karuk and the Yurok are all along that Klamath River area, and these miners disappeared in fairly close proximity to that, just a little further north.
One of the most beautiful places in the world, Yosemite, one of my favorites, absolutely stunning scenery. It draws millions and millions of visitors a year. I'm not surprised in some ways to see that the list of missing people from Yosemite is a very long one.
So, and again, everyone who listens, they have to be patient on this because, yes, so many people, you're bound to lose some people. But again, the disappearances that I quote in the book are not normal in the least. In 1954, two guys disappeared, one 26 and one 30 years. One was named Walter Gordon, disappeared in July of 54, and one was named Orvar, O-R-V-A-R, von Loss. He disappeared in October of 54. He was 30. The men didn't know each other, but they were both graduate students at UC Berkeley. They were both vacationing in Yosemite with their families. They both disappeared on trails, alone. The families found each other after they were searching and happened to run across each other at Yosemite. And if you start to think of that, how strange that was, it wasn't that the Park Service put them together. It's that they found each other. And they started to talk. And they thought, you know what? These are too similar and too weird. And our boys wouldn't voluntarily leave at all. And they started to put the pieces together. And they said, there's no way our boys would leave or get lost. They're too smart. There had to be a strange event that occurred. So they asked the Park Service at the time to bring in Special Forces troops to help with the search. Park Service refused. So they wrote a letter to President Eisenhower at the time and said what I just said. Our boys would not voluntarily leave. They were too smart. They didn't get lost. And we believe that something wrong happened here, and they want help. They want the FBI to come in. Nothing happened. No response. The boys disappeared, and that was it. There's also disappearances there where men were in areas where there were no cliffs. There were very few trees. This one case where the man had difficulty walking, and he sat in an area and he told his family, "Yeah, come back. I'll be right here." And he was on, I believe he had one crutch or one cane. They came back 25 minutes later. The man was gone, never found again. Probably one of the most perplexing ones in my mind involved a young woman named Jenny Hesselschwartz. She was from the East Coast. She was vacationing with her fiancé. They went up into the perimeter area of Yosemite and stopped to stretch their legs. And they got out and they walked around. She told her boyfriend, "Hey, I'm going to go right over here. I'm just going to take a quick walk." He said, "Hey, no problem. I'll be right here." She disappears. And he tracks down a guy who's emptying garbage cans. He calls for help, and a massive search ensues. And she's not found for, I believe it's a month and a half or 2 months. And where she's found defies anyone's belief system. There were a group of residents just outside of Yosemite that knew the park well, and they were mountaineers and rock climbers. And they went into some areas that were inaccessible to you and me with their ropes and things to fish. And in one of these areas, above where she disappeared, and in an area that you couldn't get to without advanced mountaineering skills, they found her body in a creek that was flowing lightly, but they found her, partially clothed, and in an area that they couldn't explain how she got to.
Hold that thought. We want to continue with that particular episode, as well as the strange death of a lady who appeared to have been sexually molested, perhaps after she was dead there in Yosemite. Much more to come. Our conversation with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411, right after this on Coast. I'll tell you what, these first 3 hours with David Paulides have flown by. We're not even scratching the surface. Still have the rest of the country still to cover, and we'll try to get to as much of it as we can. But, of course, there's an obvious omission here tonight. Who or what is doing this? Wolves, bears, cults, illegal aliens, drug farmers, actual aliens, Bigfoot, the books, and from our conversation tonight so far, pointedly do not speculate on what might be behind all these spooky and strange cases. Why not? We'll see if we can get David to open up a little bit of that and cover as much of the rest of the country as we can, and then open up the phone lines with a few questions from you. Lots more to come here in this final hour on Coast to Coast AM. David, could you finish up the story you were telling about the one disappearance in Yosemite and then briefly touch on another weird case there, Evelyn Roseman?
Yeah, I was going right into Roseman, and so she disappeared in October of '68. She was from San Francisco, and she was visiting with some friends. She liked to hike. She went out for a hike one day on October 19th, and she didn't come back. And what happened was this Butch Farabee, who wrote about this case extensively, had a lot more insight into it than is publicly available. And what he talked about was that Evelyn was found at the base of Nevada Falls. And that in and of itself wouldn't have been unusual, except that in Butch's book, he states that she was launched from the top of the falls to where brain matter was found on boulders near the Merced River. So what that meant is that by falling, she couldn't have reached the location where her body was found, and somehow or another she was projected out so far that it was unreasonable to assume that fall could have come accidentally. And by launching it, it was hard for him to understand how a human could have launched something that far. And it took hours for them to figure out what happened, because after she fell or was launched, and after she hit the bottom, somebody or something took her and drug her a long distance away, 200-300 yards, and then lifted her shirt and caused extreme dry lacerations in her vaginal area, meaning she was raped. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that there was never any flyers put out in the park of any danger about this. Obviously, this is still an open case, and they wouldn't comply with FOIA and release it. It's still under investigation. But this occurred in '68, and there's never been any real progress on the case, and there are no suspects to the best that Butch or anyone else knew. This is an isolated case like this as far as anyone knows, but again, because they don't put out any data, it's hard to tell how far-reaching this is.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but was there, all right, the scratches you talked about, was there any kind of other bodily fluids that would give them a clue about DNA?
Well, in '68, I'm sure that all they could do was blood type it back then.
Right. And
nowadays, I'm sure if they had some, with the DNA in California, DNA data bank, that they probably should run it. But I'm not even sure if they even have the evidence anymore.
Yeah, like homicide cases. I know the homicide detectives here have kept DNA from cases way, way back. I don't know about '60s, but certainly into the '70s. And although they didn't have the ability to test it then, they could test it now if somebody saved it.
Absolutely.
Back to, you had already told us at the beginning of the show about the attitude of the Park Service, particularly hostile there in Yosemite. A couple of folks have emailed me after hearing you and said, well, look, the Park Service is posting things online about disappearances. There's one case in particular from September about a guy who disappeared. Therefore, they must be cooperative, and you must be exaggerating the lack of cooperation. All right, have you seen it? Did they have a website that is putting incidents on the website? Is that a new development for them?
So what they do is, it's almost, I suppose they're penned into it. At the time that somebody disappears, they have to put it out. There's an individual that's on our website named George Pinka who disappeared with a group, and it's a pretty unusual event in itself. He was with a church group. He was near the back of the group, as is normal, and he disappeared. We asked Yosemite for FOIA on that. They denied it, of course. And, yeah, of course, it's put out at the time the person disappears. And then you watch, as time goes on, you will never hear another thing about it. And this is so common with disappearances inside the park system. And there's no reason for me to exaggerate anything. I don't have a bone to pick with them. The truth is stranger than any fiction I could make up. Come on. How many agencies in law enforcement are there in the world that don't have statistics, lists, locations of missing people?
I wouldn't be surprised that they keep lists of missing animals in some of these parks. Yeah. 5 moose disappeared or something like that, but pointedly don't have it for people. David, I mentioned in the sort of in the break that we're sort of dancing around discussing who's behind it, and you do that in the books, I guess on purpose. You don't speculate about it. My guess is that maybe you started this work chasing down what kinds of files the government might have about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, things of that sort. Is there a reason you don't want to speculate? I guess And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it could be that you just don't know.
So I've written a couple books about Bigfoot, and in some circles, some people would think maybe I have more knowledge than others in a certain realm of Bigfoot. But I'm also one of these kind of guys that has a pretty wide breadth of things. I do a lot of reading. I look into a lot of unusual events, and just like you know a lot about the UFO world and Area 51, George, and I've read a lot of books about abductions and John Mack and the abductee phenomena. And you start to think, well, these young kids are disappearing. And I asked some DNA experts, when's our DNA at the optimum? And it's that under 10 region where our DNA really doesn't change much, and it's at that purest state. Well, then you start to look at an area like Pennsylvania, and we didn't get into this, but we can talk about it another time, where the majority of the disappearances were young kids across an entire state in the 40s and 50s, and then it stopped. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, during a certain span of time, this age group disappears, and I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but asking about DNA in this age group, some of these, in fact, a majority of these kids eventually made it back. Most of them couldn't say what happened, but again, they have these scratches all over them. If there was some work being done on them, we'd never know because sometimes they're so scratched up, nobody knows.
Were any of the kids in the Pennsylvania cases able to say anything?
Some of the kids said some pretty strange things. There were a couple of cases where they said that they were taken by a bear, and the bear cuddled with them all night, and the bear left, and they left. And this happened more than once. And, I mean, I've talked to bear experts all over America, and they said it's not going to happen. Come on. You know, if a bear rarely is even going to approach you. A bear may approach a child, and if it approaches the child, and if it's really, really, really hungry, maybe there's going to be an attack, but it's not going to cuddle with something all night.
You know, what I wonder is how big this really could be. It's hard enough for you to get anything out of these agencies, like blood from a stone. How many cases there really may be, not only in national parks, but in the files of some other agencies, and they don't even make the connection. It also makes me wonder whether it could be happening in urban areas. If whatever's behind this is able to snatch somebody with their parents just a few feet away, they could be doing this in urban areas, and maybe it doesn't get the same kind of attention as someone disappearing in the wilderness. There's no big search party that goes out, but it could be happening under people's noses, and no one is even putting it together.
Again, that window of opportunity is so small in many of these cases that it defies common sense that it's just an accidental occurrence. And in many, many of the cases, you will read in the articles where the parents and neighbors say, this has to be an abduction. The person had to have been kidnapped. And law enforcement says, no, no, no. And then when the child is found and at a location that doesn't make any sense, law enforcement will sometimes say, you know, it's a possibility. And especially when the person shows up at a location that's been searched 5 times or is on a path where they search all the time. Another common theme is that when the victim is, so the victim disappears, immediately after the disappearance, it storms. Again, a common theme. Right after they disappear, it rains really hard. It snows or whatever. Days later, the victim is found in the clothing they were wearing sometimes, but the clothing is dry, it's clean, and their hair is clean, and there's no way they could have been outdoors. And that happened many, many times. And that's when the searchers and law enforcement start to say, you know, maybe there was something odd here. Maybe they were abducted and then dropped in a field in the middle of the corn. That's what the result was. They were found in a field in a giant cornfield, or they were found in a giant pig pen in clean clothes, but mud all around them, and they were dry.
Of course, it sounds like you are open to the possibility that there's some sort of a paranormal explanation. One of the strangest centers of paranormal activity anywhere in the world is a place that I've written about, the Uinta Basin. And that's one of the clusters you found is in the Uinta Mountains there. Can you give me a thumbnail sketch of the kinds of things that happened there?
So first of all, for people that know, the area specifically that I write about is very high up in elevation. It's above timberline. There aren't a lot of trees. There's a lot of water and a lot of lakes. And there's a couple incidents, and there are many incidents that I write about where a child disappears while they're at a summer camp with a group of kids or in a group setting with a lot of kids. The case I write extensively about that is a case called Garrett Bardsley. And Garrett was a kid that was with a Boy Scout group, and his dad went with the group, and he was 12 years old, happened in August of 2004. They walked a short distance away from camp, and they went fishing in one of the lakes. Short time after Garrett was with his dad, he slightly fell in the water, and he got wet. And he told his dad he was going to walk back to camp and change. And his dad could watch him almost the entire distance until he hit a tree line between themselves and the camp. He went into the tree line. His dad fished, waited another 10 minutes. Garrett didn't come back. He started to look for him. Then went back to the camp. Nobody saw him. A giant search ensues. And the only thing they found is they found one of his socks in a boulder field up above where he disappeared. Two things about that are fascinating to me because of all the cases I've read. People disappear in boulder fields. I have no idea why. I have no idea what the assimilation may be. Second reason is that footwear and socks tend to come off when these kids disappear. Again, I don't know why. Doesn't make any sense. But that sock was up above where he disappeared, and that doesn't make any sense because the path was obvious on where he was walking back to. There is no way he could have detoured and gotten lost.
You mentioned Yosemite, of course. What about Yellowstone?
Very, very interesting case there. A kid named Dennis Johnson. The Johnson family was on vacation. They pulled into an outlet to picnic. The dad told Dennis and his sister, why don't you go out and look for squirrels and some acorns and come on back when you're done, but we'll get everything set up and you guys just go have fun. So Dennis and his sister take off, and after a short distance, they separate. And the daughter, which is kind of, this happened in '66, the daughter is the first one that disappears. And Dennis starts looking for her and comes back to his dad. He was only 8 years old, and the daughter was, I think, 9 or 10. Dennis comes back to his dad and says, hey, I can't find my sister. Let's start looking. So Dennis and his dad start looking, and Dennis disappears unbeknownst to his dad. They split up. His dad comes back to the picnic area, and a ranger drives back in a car and says, are you missing a daughter? He says, yeah. Well, at a campsite at 2 miles away, a girl walked up, and we have her. And he goes, well, that's great, but now my son's missing. So, again, that happened in July of '66. Dennis was 8 years old. And they searched for Dennis for weeks, and they never found him. What's unusual about that event is that about 3 miles from the site where Dennis disappeared, we did get the FOIA on this. And in the reports, it said that they found some kind of shelter area where something large was sleeping under. And they didn't call it a den, they called it a shelter area. That's the second time I've heard that wording used on the disappearance of a young boy. That happened also in Crater Lake, where they found a shelter area up above where another boy disappeared with his dad. Now, Dennis Johnson and Dennis Martin, who disappeared from Great Smoky Mountains, I don't put a lot into disappearances and things and familiarities, but I gotta say that I wrote about this and it bothered me. So Dennis Johnson and Dennis Martin were both. Dennis Johnson was 8. Dennis Martin was 6. And Dennis Johnson's dad's name was William, and Dennis Martin's dad's name was William. and they both disappeared in a national park wearing a red shirt, and they both disappeared within years of each other. And I wrote about that in the book because, again, it's not that frequent that kids disappear and are never found. But both these Dennises disappeared, and they were never found. And the report specifically indicated that William Johnson and William Martin waited at that park long after the search was over, searching for their boys. And they waited for weeks afterwards, looking for more help and looking for answers, and never got it. If these two men could have met each other, I'm sure they were duplicates of each other with the way they looked for their boys. And I should say that I had the opportunity to interview Mr. Martin, Dennis Martin, who disappeared in the Great Smokies. He won't talk to the press, and I didn't call beforehand, but I walked up to his house, and he lives in Knoxville. This happened in the 60s, and I knocked on the door with another researcher, and he came out to the front porch. I told him who I was and what I was there for, and he says, I haven't talked about this event in years. Right away, he got tears in his eyes. He says, I haven't talked about this in years, and my wife and I have lived with this for a lifetime, and it's almost ruined us as people, and I just don't want to dwell on it anymore. And I told him, I said, hey, I came all the way from California to talk to you, and if I could just get a couple of answers to a couple of questions, I'd be eternally grateful.
We'll have to save those answers until after the break, and I think the audience would cut my head off if I don't open up the phone lines for at least a couple of questions, which is what we will do after this break. Continue our conversation about Missing 411 with author David Paulides. A lot of emails from listeners who tell me that they're going to have trouble sleeping tonight and are going to have a whole lot of trouble talking their family into going camping anytime soon. We're just barely scratching the surface. Arizona has a couple of clusters, including one case that's mentioned in David's book about a park ranger, National Park Service ranger who disappeared, setting off a massive manhunt, one of the strangest cases. A lot in New Mexico, several in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho, and that's just the western U.S. We haven't even touched on the eastern U.S. David mentions in the book he left out Florida and Texas on purpose because there's so many cases in those two states alone. He'd need another entire volume, so maybe we can talk him into writing another book on it. We're opening up the phone lines with your questions. Try to get to as many as we can right after this on Coast to Coast AM. It is our final segment with David Paulides. This program has just flown by. A lot of folks on the phones. I'll just ask you, callers, please get right to your point so we can get to as many as we can. East of the Rockies, Glenn in Texas. Good morning, Glenn.
Good morning, George, David. A+ on this show. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
I think I've nailed it. About 80% or so of the incidences have taken place in the range or former range or newly acquired range of one of the most insatiably curious, insatiably hungry, and almost a super animal here in America that most people probably aren't aware of. And our great-grandparents had bounties on them, and the Native Americans or the Stone Age people here in North America referred to them as devils. And that would be the wolverine. These things actually run up and down mountains looking for winter kill. During the winter, they don't hibernate. They eat everything right down to the teeth. And I'm not saying they're responsible for predation. In some cases it may be, but surely scavenging. And they're a member of the weasel family, and any buttons, zippers, shoelaces would be a problem that would have to be solved. What do y'all think?
Dave?
Well, I'm sure that it's possible, and again, I'm open to all these things. I don't have a closed mind about any part of this. That some of those bones could have been gnawed down to small pieces by animals, absolutely. But when you look at the entirety of the scene, some of the areas, there's belt buckles that are rolled up, pants that are inside out. It doesn't add up to anything that a small animal could do. But your point about the small bones has possibilities, of course.
I'm not sure how a wolverine would pick up a kid and transport it 12 miles. as well. Glenn, thank you for the call. West of the Rockies, we have a call from Central Idaho. I don't have the name there, but James. Good morning, James. How you doing?
Good, George. Hi, Dave.
Hello.
I would say half to two-thirds of those cases were mountain lions. I've seen mountain lions in action, and they're pretty awesome. I was out antler hunting one time here about a half mile from the house. I'm in the steep mountains of Idaho. Anyway, I caught sight of an elk, and I was kind of watching her. She was a big cow. She probably weighed 450 pounds or better, real healthy. And all of a sudden I saw a blur, and it was a mountain lion. It jumped on that cow, and I thought, boy, I'm going to see a hell of a battle here, and I was wishing I had a video camera, but I didn't. Anyway, I had my binoculars on it, and this thing jumped on that cow, broke its neck. The cow didn't even move, didn't have a chance to move. And it laid there for about a minute and a half, and it got up on top of the cow and licked its face off, just like a house cat does, you know. And, boy, I wished I'd have had a camera. But anyway, I'm sitting there watching it, amazed, and then it grabbed that thing by the neck. This was a female mountain lion, about 140 pounds at the most, and it drug it uphill, a slight incline, maybe 10 degrees in the snow. And then it, 20, 30 yards, maybe 20 yards. Then it stopped, took a break, did it again, and then took another break, and then dragged it uphill again about 20 yards.
I wonder if it left blood then.
Well, I couldn't tell, and I was running out of daylight, so I had to get off the mountain and get back home. And I decided I'd go back the next day and pull the ivories. Elk have a ivory that people around here prize as a trophy, you might say. I went back over there, and I figured I was within 50 yards of where that cat, see, they bury their dead, their kills, and save them for later. I guess they age them, I don't know. But anyway, I'm about 50 yards from where I figured she'd buried that first elk, and crash, bang, boom, here comes this is down in the bottom of a gully. To start with, I was on a ridge the first day. Anyway, this bull elk, he was a 4-point on each side. He had one horn busted off from a previous battle, I guess. But anyway, he crashes down the hill and lands about 20 yards from me. And, of course, that made the hair on my neck stand up because I thought the cat was right there. It was in a big pile of brush. And finally I walked over there to that elk, and I actually pulled him up on his feet. And he was kind of weak because it was into winter about this time of year. And he stood there. Got about 50 yards back away and smoked a couple cigarettes and watched him. He was so weak and shaking he couldn't move. And I know that cat came back and got it. Well, I walked out of that drainage, and I counted 10 dead elk, and I did see one of the kittens. That's how come I know it was and there was kitten tracks all over. That's how I know it was a female.
Okay, James, let's let Dave jump into this conversation.
Sure. So there were many cases that we reviewed where the possibility that a mountain lion or a cougar could have been involved, and we eliminated them. And you got to remember that when somebody disappears, that scene originally, by most accounts, is handled as a crime scene when it first occurs, because they really don't know. And so what they're looking for is they're looking for a struggle in the ground. They're looking for tracks. They're looking for indications, first of all, of animal, bear, mountain lion, whatever. None of these cases had that. And if they're, just like George said, well, would there be blood? There would be blood. There would probably be hair. There would be noise. There would be sound. There would be, things would be flown around. And when they come in with the bloodhounds and the canines, they bring in different types. They bring in some for animals. They bring in some for humans. They bring in some for dead bodies. And as we all know who are outdoorsmen, hey, some of those canines are excellent at chasing down a cougar, chasing down a bear. So I believe that in some of the incidents, possibly a cougar or mountain lion could be involved, but in those instances, we excluded the case.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it. First-time caller Bob in San Diego. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. I'll get right to the point. You had somebody on there talking a few weeks ago, David Wilcox, and he has a new book out, and it's called The Sourcefield Investigations. And in this book on chapter 17, there's that chapter pretty much deals with this stuff here. It's what you're talking about. And the name of the chapter is Time Slips, Time Warps, and Vortex Phenomenon. And they're talking, in this one I was just reading, this little kid disappeared for a little bit, and he came back, but he was in a time warp. I don't know if you ever read that or took that into consideration, but it could be an answer to it. I'll let you go and take the answer off the air. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. I mean, you're open to that idea, right, David? Without even spelling it out in the book, you're open to that possibility that it's some sort of a dimensional thing.
Absolutely, it could be.
I mean, in the ranch in Utah that we've looked at, some strange creatures that seem to slip in and out of our reality, at least according to witness reports, and those kind of things have been reported all over. I know it gets into some real high strangeness kind of stuff, but when you have a mystery of this sort, I think it's required to keep an open mind.
Well, one of the things I write about extensively is that once a researcher closes their mind off, they might as well not be called a researcher anymore. They're going after their own hypothesis, and they've closed everything else off. And there's a lot of that going on in the world, but I like to think of myself as one of those people that's open to different ideas. I know as a police investigator the proper track to take to eliminate things, but the breadth of what the possibilities may be are so extensive that I really don't close much off.
You know, of course, you have a certain fondness for Sasquatch, Bigfoot. You've been chasing that mystery for a long time. I suppose there's got to be some kind of concern that if it turns out that Bigfoot was involved in any of this, according to witnesses, or something like Bigfoot, you'd have to worry about people going out there and hunting it more than they're already hunting it.
Well, we'll go over to the Bigfoot side of the fence for a second. I mean, people have been hunting Bigfoot for years. Who's been successful?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Talk about the ranch and the farmer. That how many times has he shot things? They could never bring anything down permanently, right?
Yeah, it's true. They'd shoot something and poof, it would disappear.
Right.
Back to the phones. Andrew in Los Angeles on the wild card line. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, great show, George. And I think your guest, Dave, is sharp enough to eventually unravel the mystery. I have a real quick question. Do you know if any reports of missing children or adults, mysterious disappearances have occurred in the Flagstaff, Arizona National Forest area? And have there also been any reports in other countries in forested areas where there's a similar pattern? And also the federal silence is very suspect, and I believe there's a connection to the silence and the possible answers that you are seeking. And thank you very much for your information.
Okay. Flagstaff area, David?
So nothing comes out of me right away with that Flagstaff area. There's a region just north and east of Phoenix and an area east of Tucson. But again, it's hard to get a lot of data, and I'm not saying that nothing has happened in Flagstaff, but nothing comes out at me right now, and I didn't write about anything there. But sometimes these cases, one will pop up in the middle of nowhere every once in a while that fits the parameters that I'm looking at. And right now, nothing I remember in Flagstaff. Now, the question about the other country is a great question. And not too long ago, a couple months ago, we were reading some articles out of Australia, and I don't remember, it was a Boulder Hill area or a giant mountain of rocks where a series of people disappeared under very similar circumstances. And I didn't even want to get into it because it boggles my mind with what I'm working with right now. But that's a great question, and maybe that's the next way to go.
We'll go to our wild card line in West Texas. Lynn in West Texas. How you doing?
I'm good. How are y'all this morning?
All right.
Good.
George, first I want to tell you I appreciate how you comment on your music.
Well, thank you.
I really enjoy that. I not only enjoy the music you pick very much, but I really like the way you comment on it. I heard you make a comment that you left out Texas and Florida. Are you saying you left those out just because of the size of the states, or and I'm particularly interested in the Big Bend National Park?
So Florida and Texas have a lot of unusual disappearances. And I put in my book that I could probably write a book about each location, each state.
Anything come to mind about, is it Big Bend that you mentioned?
Yes, Big Bend. Is there, in your opinion, is there a reason other than just the size of these states why there are so many incidences?
So in the eastern version of the book, I write that there's a lot of parallels between missing people and water, and specifically swampy areas. And kids are found in the middle of swamps, around swamps, in areas where you and I wouldn't go, and kids probably wouldn't go themselves voluntarily. And if you keep in mind those swampy areas, it seems that a lot of these missing cases go with it. Now, we did take a hard look at Louisiana and Mississippi, and there's none there. So that's a bit baffling. And there is one right on the Georgia border with Alabama, a cluster. But going north up the Appalachian Mountains, it just is thick.
Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate it. David in Lake Tahoe. David, how you doing?
George and David, awesome show. I'll get right to my point. I've been to a lot of the places that you've mentioned tonight, David. I've been to Yellowstone a couple times. I just did Yosemite 2 times in this past last summer and fall. And I hike all around the Lake Tahoe area, and I live for the outdoors and the wilderness. And I would say, from my experience, the wild animals do not attack people. I've seen many bear. I've seen a few mountain lion. I've seen wolves, and they're not out there just hunting people. They're pretty much stay away. And just as you would keep your children close by when you go to the shopping mall, I would never, as much as I do this, I would never enter the wilderness and the woods without my dog and my weapons and respect the forest. I mean, you have to respect the possibility of all those things that could happen, and I don't think it has much to do or anything with wild animals, because they seem to fear us more than we do them.
You know, David makes a good point, Dave, about being careful when you're out in areas like this. I guess what advice would you give to folks, parents of small kids? You got to hold on to them, keep an eye on them.
Well, I tell you what, I think his points are right on target, and after doing this, I guarantee I look at the woods an entirely different way. Many of the kids who disappeared on a trail and got just out of sight from their parents in a very short period of time. My statement is that no more than 6 feet always in view, and I don't point a finger to these parents, because I know I raised 2 kids, and when we were in the woods we were careful, but there's also that freedom that you're in the woods and you're having fun, and even I'd always carry a gun, but still, the whole paradigm about being in a national forest or a park changes for me, and it's not for the good.
I want to thank all of our callers. We've only got a short time left, so I'm going to steal the time back. Any plans on doing a book about Texas and Florida, a third version of this?
I don't think so. If anything, I think maybe more in detail going north up into Canada. But again, this is something that's evolving as more and more details come in, and I know that there's more clusters out there that I just haven't been able to figure out because I don't have the data yet. But hopefully, with everyone's help and continuing to sift through the archives, it'll start to make more sense.
One other quick question. It's about the last time you were here, we were talking about an effort to isolate DNA samples at reported Bigfoot sighting places. Any information you give us on where that stands?
I can tell that it's been a monumental effort. I think right now we probably have over 150 different samples from across the U.S. We've been able to get mitochondrial and nuclear DNA, which is a huge step forward. And the effort is, I would say, at the 11th hour now, and we should be on the verge of something big very, very quickly.
Well, I hope you'll come back and share with us that information when the time is right. I know There have been various leaks, a lot of speculation online about it, a lot of misinformation about it as well, and I hope that hasn't caused too much damage to the research effort.
I hope not. I wouldn't believe 99% of what you read out there.
Well, that's true for no matter what the topic is. The book is Missing 411. There are two versions of it, the Western U.S. and Canada and the Eastern U.S. My guest, David Paulides, done an excellent job with it. It is a heck of a read, and I think it's the kind of thing, once you read it, you never forget it. David, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks a million, George, for the time.
Keep us in the loop. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks as well to all my folks there at Premier for helping me through the program, Tim and Gary and the call screener. I'm sorry, Jason. I'm sorry, Jason. I almost forgot your name there. And good night, everyone. I'll be back next month. The bodies of 3 women and 2 men were found in a home on Friday. Officers today arrested a 35-year-old man who apparently knew the victims. He's been booked on 5 counts of murder. Former Vice President Dick Cheney recovering in Virginia after undergoing a heart transplant a couple of days ago. His doctors today defended the operation, said Cheney did not get any special treatment in obtaining his donor heart. Cheney suffered 5 heart attacks over the past few years, so he certainly needed a new ticker. Heck of an interesting story unfolding out in the Pacific Ocean. Filmmaker James Cameron is waiting to take a little dive to the bottom, way down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth. 7 miles down, they figure they'll dive, which would be the deepest anyone has ever gone. Bad weather postponed the dive, according to the AP. We have a story about it on the Coast website. Also there, a new edition of Naps News compiled by webmaster Tim Binnall and me. One story on our list about President Obama's visit to Roswell a couple of days ago. While he's there, of course, he made some wisecracks about he still wants to keep all the secrets, an offhand reference, of course, to the Roswell incident. Yuckity yuck yuck. Real funny stuff. I'd say it's even less funny when you look at the record of the Obama administration on issues of openness in government. Despite all the promises that he made as a candidate, by some standard, he's even less open, has thrown up more roadblocks to freedom of information than his predecessor, who was pretty bad about secrecy in government. Also, there is a link to the National Security Archives. If you want to know how our government keeps tabs on what everyone else has underground, facilities-wise, base-wise, there's a pretty cool report on this link here. And if you follow national security and secrecy issues, that website is one great resource. If you think UFO sightings started with Kenneth Arnold in 1947, check another link we have in Naps News. It's about early American UFO sightings as far back as 1639. A couple of other newsworthy bits and pieces there, including sightings of a dog-headed pig monster in Africa. Take a look at all that when you get some time. Time now to jump feet first into the deep end of the pool. What has happened to hundreds of people who vanished into thin air? We'll hear the story from David Paulides right after this on Coast to Coast AM. As I mentioned, Dave Paulides has been my guest a couple of times on this program, and I find him to be one of the very most credible, most knowledgeable interviewees when the subject comes to Bigfoot, Sasquatch. He holds 2 degrees from the University of San Francisco, spent 20 years in law enforcement and senior executive positions in the technology sector, had a boyhood camping experience with his father in the late 60s that got him hooked on the subject of Bigfoot, and then a couple of years ago, he was one of the founders of the North America Bigfoot Search, written a couple of really excellent books on it. And I suspect that it was his interest in that topic that got him started on this one. But the new book is, as I mentioned, Missing 411, 2 volumes. Dave, great to have you back on the program.
Hey, George, thanks for having me.
Spooky stuff. Spooky.
It's very, very strange.
Let's start this way. You started asking questions at national parks, asking questions. I can guess what they were about, and you sort of caused a little hubbub within the National Park Service. They're not being very cooperative, but one night you get a knock on the door. You don't want to say where because you don't want to give the source away, but tell me that story and how you started down this path.
So I was in the park and just asking some questions, talking to people. I usually don't go to the Park Service themselves because they're pretty closed-mouthed about things, but some of the employees on the periphery that are employed by the concessionaires and things, they talk. And it got around that I was there, and there aren't many places to stay in the location I was at. And in the middle of, just before we went to bed, there was a knock at the door, and the guy says, Dave, you probably don't know me, but I heard you were in the park. I know of your work. I know of your background, and I think there's a story here that you would be apt to investigate, and I think there's something there. And he came in, and we ended up talking for quite a while. And he had worked at a couple of different parks, and he had experienced the same phenomena at each park, and that is that there were disappearances in the park that didn't make a lot of sense on the front, and there wasn't much investigation going on the back end after the people disappeared, and there was even fewer press releases and press follow-up and media coverage about the issues. And he said that he thought that it was unusual and it wasn't normal, and if it had happened in a city or in a county where there was sheriff's officer, PD jurisdiction, that it would be getting far more press and far more follow-up, and he just thought it was very odd that this kept recurring where he was at. And he says, I don't want to raise a red flag, but I know you do thorough investigations, and, maybe you'd look into this. I said, it sounds interesting, and for sure. And he left. I only had one conversation with this person, never had another conversation with him again, didn't do any follow-up with him. And on the way home, I had a few conversations with some people that I work with, and I threw the idea by him. I said, get on the computer, see what you can find. And right away they did some archive search, and they said, there's something here. And that started a 3+ year, 7,000-hour investigation that ended up covering North America, U.S. and Canada, and we ended up phenomenally finding 28 clusters of missing people in rural areas of North America. And that includes not only national parks, national forests. This could be just open space of the Department of the Interior, and even one of our clusters is the entire state of Pennsylvania. And I know that may not make sense when I'm saying it right now, but in a speck of time in the late 40s and 50s, there were so many missing kids in that state that disappeared under phenomenally similar circumstances that I know that nobody would have been able to put it together unless you sat down and did something stupid like we did and just gnawed away at the data. And the way they disappeared, the times they disappeared, the locations, it just all falls in a very strange phenomena.
When you were first telling me what you were working on some time ago, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, but it would take a lot of convincing because, of course, it is wilderness. It's wild. It's the woods. People get lost in the woods. People get lost out in the middle of nowhere. They fall down. They hurt themselves. They get disoriented. Bad weather, animal attacks, whatever. Just seemed to me like, I could think of a lot of reasons why people would disappear out there, but you're talking about something at a whole different level. Why don't we approach that in talk about the general premise, and then we'll get into some specifics.
So let's separate disappearances between voluntary and involuntary. A lot of people want to disappear. They may be suicidal. They just want to fall out of the world. They want to take off. There's no crime in that. They can do it. And let's say that's adults. But when you talk about kids, and I say kids, say anything under than 10, 11, 12, I have two. I can't see my kids wanting to even step more than 100 feet away from our campsite, especially when it's starting to get dark, because there's always this stigma about darkness and force. And so those are involuntary disappearances. And when you look at those and you start to look at hundreds of cases, you start to see similarities that start staring at you. And your initial assessment that, people disappear in the woods, it's a natural phenomenon. It happens. Exactly, it does happen. But if there's an animal attack, let's say a bear attack or a mountain lion attack, there's going to be fallout from that searchers and law enforcement personnel are going to find. They're going to find a lot of tracks. There's going to be a lot of blood.
Yeah.
There might be a lot of clothing. But in these disappearances, you're not finding that. And when they bring tracking dogs in, canines, bloodhounds, they do strange things. And a lot of times, they can't even find a scent. But at other times, when you read the search and rescue logs or you read the articles in the papers from years and years ago, every once in a while, there's something very critical in there that a lot of writers and a lot of search and rescue people won't put in, but that is the dog sits down and won't search. It'll walk up to say a fork in a trail, and it'll just stop. And the handler will put a note in there, unusual, dog won't move, or dog doesn't feel like searching or whatever it might be. The other part that's unusually strange, and search and rescue people have faced this hundreds of times, and that is that the canine or the bloodhound will track to a river. And we're talking a big river, a tough one for you and I to cross, but any kid under 10 would never cross it. And they track it to a river. Well, the assessment is the kid went in the river, kid drowned. And that's essentially the end of the search. If they're really thorough, and this has happened a couple times, they'll dam the river, get permission from Fish and Game, shut it down, and search. And every one of the times they've done that, they never find the missing child. Now, a few of the times, under very unusual circumstances, a search and rescue professional says, we'll search the other side just for the heck of it. And son of a gun, if not on the other side, miles away, they find the kid. Now, how did the kid cross the river? Now, search and rescue people won't answer it, and it's left in the dark, and it's never answered in a report. But the question is, how did the kid get across?
It's not only rivers. I should say I think that was the eeriest part of the book, is reading about the distance that some of these kids travel, dead of winter, no shoes on. They are found, and they're going counterintuitively up mountains. Talk about that in generalities, and then we'll get into it in specifics.
So in the search and rescue world, there's parameters that are set down based on topography, whether it's hilly ground, flat ground, river, water, cold, wet, dry, hot, and they base it on the age, the health, and on these topographical conditions about how far to set out the grid pattern. And many, and we'll talk about kids here, many of these times in these cases, these kids are found way outside the parameters. And I'm not talking 25% outside. I'm talking several 100% outside. And just like you said, one of the common themes that you'll read about in these stories is that the kids are found without shoes. Now, what I keep looking to find in the reports is when the child's found, I want to know what the condition of their feet are. But it's never mentioned. Because my question is that if their feet walked 14 miles over 3 mountain ranges in 14 hours at the age of 8 years old, wow, those feet must be destroyed. But they never mention it. And if you read the guidelines on the search and rescue versus what's found here, they make completely no sense. And I think a lot of times the search and rescue people are perplexed, but they do an extremely competent job with the parameters that they have. And when they reach these cases that are completely outside the norm, I think many times the kids may never be found because there's no rational reason to search out that far.
One of the other things, we'll talk about this generally too, and then get specifics as we go along, is the clothing. You mentioned about having kids having no shoes on, that you would find pieces of clothing here or there, but there's some really weird stuff goes on with clothing that further perplexes the whole thing. In that, a bear attacks somebody and eats them, there are going to be bits and pieces of clothing show up in the scat. It doesn't happen in these cases. In fact, some of the clothes look like they're taken off and just folded there, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's several cases where people are eaten up, and there's just bits and pieces of them, and they find a pair of pants nearby where one of the pant legs or both pant legs are turned inside out, as though something has taken the pants off of the people before they ate them. And then scat nearby of a bear is analyzed, and there's no human remains in the scat, and there's no clothing remains. And later we can talk about a case out of the Yukon Territory with a really famous guy named Bart Schleier, exactly what happened. Another case out of northern Canada with a young girl, same thing happened. Now, if I talked about this by itself, say Schleier's case or the girl in northern Canada, no one would think much about it, and it was an anomaly. But I know that nobody has ever put multiple cases together like this and said, wow, what's happening? This can't be coincidence. There's got to be a reason. Somebody wrote to me a while ago, and they said, Dave, we just read your book, and oh my God, this applies. And it's a theme out of James Bond. And he said, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, mystery time is enemy action. And that's kind of what I think sometimes with this, because it happens too many times to be coincidence.
Well, as I said, we're going to get into specifics. I intentionally want to focus, after this break, I want to focus on the National Park Service, federal agencies, I guess including the FBI, because am I correct in putting it this way, that you ran into a stone wall right from the get-go?
That'd be a fair assessment.
And so were you able to, I can't tell if you were able to, I know a lot of these files, you rely on media reports, so you know that these incidents happened, but did you ultimately fail in getting all the information that you wanted to get using freedom of information?
So one thing I say in the book is that the people that work in the park that you and I see when we drive in, those people are phenomenal. They service us. They work for the good of the Park Service. They know nothing about what we're talking about. I'm talking about probably the top 15 people in the Park Service know what we're talking about right now and know what they're doing, and they're doing it methodically and logically. And that is that when we first started off, we knew that the Park Service had one of the largest federal contingent law enforcement groups of any that patrol open spaces. With a law enforcement group that size, and the number of, there's over 350 different monuments, parks, et cetera, that they patrol, they've got to have a pretty good database of knowledge. And we have the Freedom of Information Act that's given to us by the government, where we can retrieve information and data from our federal agencies.
Dave, I'm going to ask you to stop right there, because I want to pick that story up when we come back, just how much difficulty you ran into right off the bat in dealing with the National Park Service in particular. Stay with us. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with David Paulides about his new 2-volume book, Missing 411. When we come back, we resume the conversation about the stone wall he ran into. And it's not just a refusal to give information. It's a real haughty attitude on the part of the National Park Service. That and more coming up on Coast to Coast AM. All right, David, you were saying before we took the break that the National Park Service has this gigantic law enforcement apparatus, and one would think if there are hundreds of people disappearing for whatever reason within the national parks, that they would keep some kind of a list and would want the public to know about it. What did you find?
Well, let's back up for a second. Let's just talk about a municipal law enforcement agency or a sheriff's department in the U.S. of moderate size. Almost all of them have a website, and almost all of them have a missing person aspect to that site, meaning that they list the people missing in that jurisdiction, date, time, location, etc. And it allows the public to keep an eye out for these people, let you know what's going on in the community, etc. Well, the National Park Service has a big website, and it has a lot of things on it. There's no missing person website portion to that website. There's no links. There's no mention of it anywhere. But, with the knowledge that if I was running a national park and I had limited...
Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land into your town, into your home, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings to all of you from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophony of conversation. Glad to be back with you once again. As listeners and members of the Coast family know, the kind of material we cover on this program night after night, we plunge headfirst into UFOs, ghosts, the paranormal, conspiracies, things that go bump in the night. Every now and then, though, we run face first into a mystery that is new, or at least one that has a new twist. After we hear about it, we never quite look at the world in the same way. And tonight, we've got one of those kind of programs. This is spooky stuff. And I think those of you who are listening tonight are going to remember this interview for a long time. It'll pop back into your heads the next time you go camping, or if you take the family to a national park, or even if you go for a hike through the woods near your house. It's not only one mystery, it's hundreds of mysteries, because that's how many people have vanished, as if into thin air. The true number could be much higher. Probably no one knows what it is. We really don't know. That's the flip side of this coin. Another mystery. Why the government agencies in charge of our national parks and forests have kept a lid on this. They not only haven't told us, but have gone to great lengths to not even keep tabs on this confidentially, as if they don't want to know themselves. And they sure as hell don't want us to know either. Where have we heard that before? My guest is David Paulides, a longtime lawman turned business executive turned Bigfoot hunter and author. David is one of my favorite guests. I've interviewed him on Coast a couple of times about his remarkably well-documented books about Sasquatch encounters among Native Americans. That work sort of led him to the subject at hand. He started looking into disappearances in wilderness areas, national parks and forests, and ran into a stone wall. But he's compiled this gigantic collection of missing person files, so many that he couldn't fit them all into one book, so he's written two. The title of both is Missing 411, but he has subtitles. One of the books focuses on the western U.S. and Canada, the other on the eastern part of our country. No matter where you live and where you're listening to this program from, there's a case, maybe several cases, not that far from your home. And the millions of people who visit national parks every year need to know about this, need to be aware so they can pay attention, take precautions. But the government sure as hell isn't going to tell you about it. Dave Paulides is. And yes, when I first heard the premise, I thought, well, there could be all sorts of reasons why people vanish out in the woods. I mean, it's easy to get lost out there. That's wilderness. People can get hurt. They get attacked by animals. Sometimes they could be kidnapped by criminals operating out there or crazy people. But as you will hear, the weird circumstances that pop up in these case files over and over make it clear that something else is afoot here. People are being snatched, taken, lured, some of them almost entranced. We'll approach the topic in sort of the same way that Dave lays out his books, case by case, because I think that's the best way to point out that explaining all of this is not going to be easy. There's no one-sentence explanation that'll make them all go away. It's just weird. And some of these tales will chill you right down to the marrow of your bones. We'll need more than the usual time to cover all this ground, so Dave will be joining me in just a few minutes from now. A couple of quick news notes, though. A monster earthquake in the ocean off the coast of central Chile today, 7.2 on the Richter scale. The government there ordered the evacuation of some coastal areas, fearing a tsunami. No word yet on deaths or injuries. In San Francisco, police have arrested a man in connection with the gruesome murders of 5 people.